Okay, good morning, esteemed colleagues, distinguished participants here in Abidjan, and those joining us online. Welcome to the third and the final day of the AfDB Development Evaluation Week, an event organized by the Independent Development Evaluation, IDEV, in collaboration with the various departments of the African Development Bank Group. We are honored by your presence and grateful for your commitment to Africa's development. So this year's theme, Navigating Rough Seas Towards a Brighter Horizon for Africa, underscores the critical need for resilience and strategic thinking as we confront some of the continent's most urgent challenges. Together, we seek to chart a course that leads to inclusive and sustainable growth. So as we enter the fourth session of Evaluation Week, we turn our attention to today's theme, strategic evolution of the strategic fragility lens for transformational change. While fragility is often seen as a challenge, it also offers unique opportunity to rethink our strategies and implement innovative solutions that can transform the future of vulnerable regions. IDEV's evaluations have been instrumental in shaping the facility and the bank's support to countries and regions in fragile situations. We will hear more about this in today's session. My name is Jane Musumba, Division Manager at IDEV. I lead a team focused on knowledge management, outreach, and evaluation capacity development. And it is my privilege to guide you through this session today. Our format for this session is as follows. So we'll begin with opening remarks, followed by a moderated panel discussion. Finally, we'll open the floor for the Q&A segment. Your questions and contributions are important to this dialogue. So I invite you all to listen attentively, engage thoughtfully, and participate actively. Together, we can harness the transformative power of reimagined fragility lens and uncover innovative pathways to sustainable peace and development. But before we get into the program, just a quick, gentle reminder. This is a hybrid event. Therefore, we have participants both in the room and online. So a few housekeeping rules. First, please make sure your mics are muted and or off for those in the room. We have interpretation in English and French. For those online, please select the language of your preference by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen. For those in the room, please use the headset and select a channel that fits your language preference. Third, during the Q&A, you have two options. You can raise your hand and the moderator will select the participant accordingly, or you can type your question or comment in the Q&A or chat box for those of you online. And finally, we are recording today's session, so you will receive a link to the recording via email within a few days. Now, I'm delighted to invite my esteemed colleague, Frederick Teufel, to open today's session and guide us into the panel discussion. Frederick Teufel is the lead coordinator in the Transition States Coordination Office at the African Development Bank Group, where he drives innovative financing for humanitarian development peace efforts, utilizing private sector partnerships, technology, and conflict-sensitive strategies. Previously, he advised AfDB Vice President for Regional Development, Integration, and Business Delivery, so supporting the bank's annual lending program and institutional reforms. He has over 18 years of experience in development finance with a focus on Africa and Latin America. He also has led preparations of various publications, including AfDB's 2014 to 2021 strategy for addressing fragility and building resilience in Africa. So welcome, Frederick, my esteemed colleague and a new friend, I must say so. Welcome, Frederick.
Thank you so much, Jane, for these warm remarks. And it is really a pleasure to be here with you and have the opportunity to both provide some introductory remarks and moderate this panel with esteemed colleagues from both the bank, but then also from the World Food Programme and the International Committee of the Red Cross. So first of all, my thanks really goes to the Independent Evaluation Department for dedicating a session to this topic as part of this year's Evaluation Week. We know that fragility is on the rise globally and within Africa. And this is why this is a very timely session to look back at what it is that we have learned, what it is that independent evaluation has shown us, what works, what doesn't work, and where it is that we need to move forward together in partnership at the humanitarian development and peace nexus. So just to set the context a little bit. Today in Africa, there are more than 40 million forcibly displaced people. This comprises 32 million refugees, meaning people that have left their countries of origin, and 8 million, 32 million internally displaced that stay within their country, and 8 million refugees. Now, this is double the number compared to 2016. And the trend is really on that increasing front. Now, we know that conflict is the main driver of forced displacement and food insecurity. And conflict incidents in Africa are also on the rise. In 2009, there were about 30,000 conflict incidents, and this has risen to over 23,000 in 2022. 10 years ago, the Sahel, basically, there was no incident of terrorist attacks. Today, it is the highest concentration globally of terrorist attacks. We also know that 82% of the record 149 million people in Africa that face acute food insecurity live in conflict-affected countries. Climate shocks are only exacerbating the situation, and insecurity deters investments. So this is where now the emphasis has to switch to invest more in prevention and strengthen our systems to respond to crisis. Now, let me just take you a little bit on the journey of the African Development Bank in approaching this topic of fragility and resilience. We started on this journey 20 years ago as the first multilateral development bank that created a dedicated post-conflict country facility for countries in conflict. This was born out of the recognition that these countries were disadvantaged when it came to resource allocation. So we created this facility and kept evolving it to provide additional resources to these countries that needed it most. This then, it became in 2008, the Fragility, the Fragile States Facility. And then it turned in 2014 into the Transition Support Facility. Now, over this period, we've also learned that it's not enough to just have more resources. We also need to deploy these resources more effectively. And this is when in 2008, the bank also supported the OECD principles for good engagement in fragile states. And one of the main points of these principles was to take context as a starting point and to make sure that, that investments do no harm. This is what we have over time translated into a fragility lens at the African Development Bank. And we have, therefore, in 2008, we were the first MDB to prepare a dedicated strategy for fragile states. And in 2012, this was evaluated by our independent evaluation department to inform the subsequent version of the bank's strategy for addressing fragility and building resilience in 2014. Again, we benefited from an independent evaluation of this strategy in 2020 to inform our current strategy from 2022 to 2026. In 2022, we also benefited from an independent evaluation of our transition support facility, which is informing the reforms that we are continuing to make. So the African Development Bank's engagement in fragile situations has very much benefited from independent evaluation findings. Now, what is important to also always remember is that change takes time. So therefore, it is also evaluations look always back at what an institution has done, what are the lessons learned, and then it provides a number of strategic recommendations that we then implement. But also implementing these recommendations, institutionalizing them, is something that takes time. And I think this is really something to bear always in mind. And this is also where we are now putting our attention as we are embarking on the midterm review of our current strategy for addressing fragility and building resilience, which is starting now, and where we will align recommendations also then with the bank's new 10-year strategy that was just approved from 2024 to 2033. These longer time frames are critical for our agenda, because we know we cannot achieve impact, particularly when it comes to building institutions, to promoting inclusion, to catalyzing private sector. We cannot make progress on these agendas just within 3-4 years. We do need longer time frames. Now, what are some of the lessons that we have learned thanks to these independent evaluations and also to our internal reviews? So, first, I think we need to continue to invest in financial innovation, to mobilize more resources for these countries that are affected by conflict and fragility. When we look at allocations of ODA, we see that these countries are still disadvantaged. When we look at allocations from climate finance, we see that these countries struggle to attract it. When we look at private investments, we see that these countries find it hard to attract investments. So therefore, we need to continue to place a dedicated effort on mobilizing more resources for those countries that are particularly affected by conflict and fragility. Now, the second lesson, and this is really one that that we already reflected in our 2014 strategy, meaning 10 years ago, but we do see that that it is still not the best practice across the ecosystem, is that fragility doesn't respect borders. Fragility is relevant, is affecting all countries to different degrees. So this is therefore, we need to move away from a country-based approach only on fragility, but we have to look at these topics holistically and how it affects all countries. And this is also our understanding of fragility is one of pressures. It means what are the different pressures now that can be economic, social, political, climate, regional, that are affecting a country, and what is the country's capacity to cope with these challenges? If it doesn't have a lot of capacity, it risks breaking, and this is what fragility is all about. So this is why we are applying, therefore, the fragility agenda for the entire continent, for all countries. Then another a lesson for us that we have learned over this period is that when we engage around this agenda, fragility by itself is not always the best entry point. We need to address fragility, but we need to build resilience. So this is why we have very much intentionally complemented the initial focus on fragility, basically the problem, the risk, with resilience, no? Which is more of the solution and the opportunity. And this is therefore, when we look at our engagement in this space, we look at how can we build resilience? What are the sources of resilience in these environments, and how can we invest in these sources? And this is also something where we have realized it's important for our policy dialogue with the stakeholders and particularly the authorities, because putting countries into a box of fragile state is not necessarily helpful. Then another lesson that we have learned is how do we program resources? Initially, when we started off also with mobilizing additional resources through our facility, this was basically then used to almost top up what the bank was doing in general. And because the investment gap is so high. Now, over time, we have realized, however, that we do need to use these resources to be more intentional about how they are used and the theory of change underlying their deployment, to make sure that we achieve intentionally a humanitarian development and peace impact. Because it is not enough to just have more resources. We need to look at how we use these resources and how can we achieve synergies with other resource flows. Because this dimension of working in partnerships at the HDP nexus, now as it is called, the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus, is really critical. And this is also why we are very happy to talk today with colleagues from these other communities, because it's not enough for each institution to improve, but we do need to make progress as a system. Then some lessons that we have learned about applying fragility sensitivity, conflict sensitivity into our lending and non-lending activities. The topic of fragility has been considered a cross-cutting issue, and accordingly, it has been mainstreamed into the business model of our institution and of other institutions. Now, this is a very important aspect to mainstream and institutionalize this agenda. And we have made great progress. In fact, we are the only institution that has systematically institutionalized the fragility lens application. So all projects funded by the bank in all countries undergo an assessment to ensure that it is fit for purpose, that it reflects the fragility context, and that it contributes to building resilience. Now, this is very relevant for us to enhance the quality at entry of our project design. But we also know that there are limitations and there are at times competing interests in terms of different cross-cutting issues, all of which have to be reflected within the same operation. And this can lead also to a compliance culture where basically these topics can become a checklist. And then this diminishes the impact of the agenda in terms of influencing the theory of change of the operation. And so this is where we see the importance of really increasing our emphasis on intentionality from the very beginning. And this is therefore the results that we envisage. No? Do we want to explicitly look at addressing a problem of refugees in a country and forcibly displaced people, or is it an afterthought? And we are leveraging our facility by introducing a new programmatic approach that allows us to guide basically the resource allocation, but this is only then there for a limited number of investments, whereas our ambition naturally is to increase the intentionality on this agenda across all of the bank's investments. Then another lesson that we have learned is the importance of engaging with the private sector. In 2014, there was basically no recognition that the private sector could actually play a role in these environments and be part of the solution. This has changed significantly. Today, everybody recognizes the importance of working with the private sector, of attracting more investments, but then also of ensuring that these investments contribute to building peace and prosperity in the country, because we have also learned that particularly foreign direct investment in extractive industries can also exacerbate conflict. So we need to make sure that these types of investments are done in a way that they contribute to building resilience. And we also need to adopt the long-term perspective on building the local private sector, because this is ultimately the sector that gives hope to the people that they can build a future for themselves and get out of this fragility trap, which has in many instances endured for a very long time. Because now, in closing, I would like to highlight the role of partnership. We have seen instances like in Somalia, where protracted crises have lasted for decades. And we have seen a humanitarian development and peace-building actors engaging in parallel over decades. And synergies in terms of the programming of resources are still limited. There are still too many individual projects, very often small scale. And this is what we need to change going forward. We need to move towards more joint programming and also reduce the burden and transaction cost of individual projects for the country. And this requires a different type of partnership at the HDP nexus. We've made a lot of progress when it comes to these partnerships. At the bank, we have done a fiduciary principles agreement with the UN system in 2017, which now allow us to easily channel resources to the UN system in situations of conflict and when we no longer can engage ourselves in these environments. So this is therefore an area where we need to continue to make progress as a system, and again recognize the challenges that we've had in the past and the opportunities that exist for us going forward. So with these introductory remarks, I would now like to introduce my panel. And I'm really very glad to be joined by Margot van der Velden. She is the regional director for Western Africa at the World Food Programme, and she has more than 20 years of experience working with WFP, and she will therefore help us understand the role of WFP in these environments, the lessons they have learned in this process, working in humanitarian context, and then increasingly working also with development partners, including the African Development Bank. Then I'm very happy to also have Fidi Rajaunsen with us. He is the manager of the International Committee of the Red Cross's Development Center of Expertise, with which we have just signed a memorandum of understanding last year. So building on an initial letter of intent in 2019. And so we are currently also in the process of developing an operational framework agreement with them. And so I'm looking forward to hearing his perspectives on these issues. And then last but not least, our own colleague, Daniel Doy. He is the country manager in Burkina Faso currently. Previously, he was a country manager in Burundi, and also before that, a country economist within the bank. So thank you very much, colleagues, for joining us on this panel. Now, I would like to start it off with you, Margot, there. And I would appreciate it if you could tell us a little bit about the experience of the World Food Programme when it comes to its strategies and programs, and how you, over these past decades, how have you learned basically to better adapt your modalities of engagement there, and what are some of the lessons learned in this regard? Margot, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Frederick, and first of all, congratulations, I think, to the bank for all of this, the thought leadership that you have given to this, I think, this fragility lens, the resilience lens, and as you described from where you already started, you were clearly spearheading this dilemma, and so congratulations for that, and thanks also for the partnerships we have I think built over the last so many years with the bank. Is getting better and better. So in West Africa we have a very strong partnership, and really appreciate that. And I also would like to thank you for having me on this panel, but it shows that how you want to continue to learn and think and be a real partner. So real appreciation for that, Frederick and Jane. And I think that's the only way forward, no? And you setting this stage. So thank you for that. Now, just maybe a bit of a view on West Africa region. I mean, I think you described it all so well already, but very much the fragility is very much intertwined, no? And there's conflict and the escalation of conflict is one, but then the impact of climate change is really the other one, and we just see it these days also with the floods increasing. But what we also see is like unfortunately a trend of food insecurity and nutrition insecurity that's not going in the right direction, and and hence we have these challenges that we're facing by leading by trying to do something about these trends that are going in the wrong direction. I think there's 4 or 5 things, and you mentioned some of them that we faced with that are the main challenges I think to deal with this. And one is one of scalability. I think we have a magnitude of a problem, a complexity of a crisis situation, a complexity of intertwined causes of food insecurity, and the capacity of the systems to deal with that is not at the scale that we need to be. No, so the scale is a big issue. You mentioned it, but it's very, very, very true. I think we have a serious problem of fragmentation in supporting the governments, in supporting the communities. Many scattered projects with questionable impact if you truly look at it. So real problem. And then the other problem is what we're facing is this is one of crisis protraction. And I think we are dealing with some of these issues as if they were a crisis, but they have become protracted situations. And dealing with the protracted or the structural food insecurity, structural problems through a crisis lens is not going to be the solution. No? So we have to break that cycle and reduce the needs for humanitarian assistance and rather build resilience now. And then I would say the fourth thing is really around the financing. And you mentioned it, there's not enough financing. I also think there's not enough innovation in the financing. I think we haven't figured out from the WFP side really the co-financing elements of how that would work. And so I think we are pushing ourselves to be more knowledgeable and more innovative and more out of the box thinking. I think the system as a whole is needing a bit of a shake up. No, and I think that's what we faced with from the WFP side in this current situation, that we feel we need an absolute paradigm shift. No, what we have been doing clearly is not enough, and business as usual is also not good enough anymore in this situation where we just continue to see the needs rising in terms of humanitarian needs in this region and food insecurity rising. So what is really needed from our in our strategies is that we have long-term transformative solutions in parallel to where the humanitarian assistance is required. No, and that requires that we strengthen the national systems. That requires that we build the community's resilience to shocks, and that we do that in parallel through resilience building program, but also through social protection programs. And so in WSP's portfolio, we have at the moment like 50% is dedicated to resilience programs and programs addressing some of the root causes, and 50% is linked to crisis response, and that highlights, I think, a little bit what you were talking about on the nexus approach. And we do that internally, and then it's of course also how do we do that then in partnerships with others. So for me, there's 3 or 4 big ones, and I think you mentioned them, but just maybe to re-emphasize them. One is really that I think there's a lot of good concepts, a lot of good talks and theories of change, which are absolutely needed. But I think what we really need to see is both at the grassroots level and at the national system level, a real effort to design and implement at scale actions that are shock responsive, that are better anticipating, that are preventing the impacts of these crises, that are anticipating those crises, and that are then also responding to the crisis. But I think the whole sort of holistic view is absolutely quite, both at national system level and at grassroots level, to really work on these broken ecosystems that we faced with in Western Africa. The second one is really to break down the silos, and I think we can't say it enough, but there is an awful lot of silos, and often donor driven, often money driven. But there needs to be a coalition of partners. There needs to be a shared vision to really do something at scale, jointly with the government, co-created with the government, co-created with the international financial institutions, the civil society, around really a common vision and a common standpoint, that translates then these statements into actions at scale. And it's also very loud and clear that we hear from the governments. No, so this is where these nexus is really real. No, it's not just a concept. It's real. We truly need to work side by side to get there, and then at scale. So for example, what we do in the Sahel countries at the moment, where every year for the last 20 years we have had to come during the period of the hungry season or the lean season, we have had to come with humanitarian assistance, food assistance, cash assistance to the most vulnerable populations, and that has been going on for 20 years. So the son of the father now, or it's like generational sort of, and that is really quite unfair. The humanitarian assistance is now being blamed as the one that is causing all of these problems. But I think we need to see it a little bit differently. I think we need to see this as a problem of all of us. And the only way to go forward with this is that we will need to have larger investments in these areas where the ecosystems are so degraded, where water and soil degradation is so much impacting negatively the livelihoods of these communities. We need to jointly invest in the prevention, no? And we need to invest in resilience of these communities. These communities, they are facing these climate extremes. We're seeing enormous resilience of these communities already, but with helping them truly to tap into the potential that's there of water, of soils. We have large scale investment in resilience building, and we see the positive impacts of this. We see that this creates jobs. We see that this reduces the migration of populations to the southern parts of Western Africa. We see that the voice of the women is more heard. No, we see that the land actually provides livelihoods and food for the populations, and it also improves the social cohesion. So it deals with these natural resource management conflicts. It deals with the degradation of the national resources, but it also brings back the communities and the dignities and the sort of cohesion among the communities. So I think this is really promising, and if we know that this works, we need to continue doing this further at scale. The third one is really around the anticipatory action. I think we need to make this sort of terminology reality, because we do know that there is mechanisms that will predict where the problems are going to come from, and we have also responses and lessons learned and independent evaluation showing that investments in anticipatory action will be much more cost effective and cost effective. And then I think, as I said, I really think for us in Western Africa, we want to break this cycle of humanitarian assistance, and that can only be done through these large scale national systems of resilience building and social protection. So looking for that, we have created a coalition of partners already, and we're trying to create a strong movement. This is what the governments are asking for as well. They want to get away with the humanitarian assistance, and sort of working together around this is really my last point is really to say that I think as a community we need to be a little bit very ambitious, but at the same time also realize that we can't tackle all the priorities at once. And I think we need to be selective in choosing the investments, the priority investments that we tackle first, and then we do them at scale and get the transformation that we're looking for, instead of trying to tackle all and everything at once. The problems are really massive, and the governments are having massive issues at scale. So let's also help them prioritize where the large investments and the cost benefits and the return of investments are most needed. So working on the resilience, working on the food systems, building back the food systems, building back social protection for those that are needing it, building jobs, creating jobs, working with the youth, and have the capacity of the people to deal with these problems is the focus that we have taken, Frederik, in West Africa for now.
Thank you so much, Margot. No, this is really interesting to hear basically your perspective on that, and that we can really relate to this. Now, I would now like to pass to you, Fidi, so that you can share your experience, lessons learned, and perspectives on these issues.
Thanks a lot, Frederik, and also allow me to congratulate the African Development Bank for really trailblazing, this agenda. We are working together, and we intend to do more, and this is really for the communities that we serve. So thanks for that. Just a few words really on our perspective from the ICRC. So we have this very unique mandate to ensure that humanitarian protection and assistance in our conflict can be delivered, and in that we really notice the same trends. The contexts are more and more volatile. Sorry, the nature of the conflicts are rapidly changing, more protracted. New regions that were previously spared are now also affected. There's an increasing move towards urbanized conflict as well. And the digital space and the cyberspace is now a new territory for conflict. So very dynamic with very worrisome trends, and this is really, I think, part of the reasons why partnership is really key. ICRC has evolved actually over the years on how we tackle these issues. Especially with the intentionality of working with development actors. By doing that, there are two ways of working. One is really to support the agenda of staying engaged, to make sure that the resources and the capacity to deliver is there also for the development partners that we work with. And the second one is to thinking about responsible exits from humanitarian contexts, because we know that if we want to achieve sustainability of the impact that we achieve under a humanitarian setup, we really need to be intentional in exiting responsibly. There is also as a very important trend and lesson, the compounded nature of crisis. I think you mentioned it, Margot, as well. Climate change is there, the energy and food crisis, the macroeconomic shocks, and this is happening really now. And yet, it's still very difficult to get the resources to be deployed, as you said. And this is against needs that are getting larger and larger. And just to give you an example where we see investments that are not being done. We know, for example, that now in Africa, there are around 50 million people who are living in areas controlled by non-state armed groups, and they cannot be served. The protracted nature of the conflicts also means that you have generations who have lived their life under conflict, and they are not benefiting from the support that they deserve. So here there's also a question of justice, and it is for us to really reflect on that. And here really, and I will end with this point, because I think this is really critical. It is the dimension of partnership. This is not easy. For us, at least, it took us many iterations to get it right. A lot of learning together with development partners and development actors. Just 3 points there, and I think it's important to highlight knowledge as well, because we generate knowledge with experience, and this is how we can improve. So just a few lessons there for us to reflect. First one, complementarity of mandates to address the challenges is really important. We have to really work on that synergy. We were not founded and made to work together, so there's a lot of work in terms of translation to make sure that eventually we can take the partnerships to scale. There's a second lesson that is really about the inclusion of communities from the onset. You mentioned applying a fragility lens, but part of it is also to adopt an inclusion lens from the onset, and then also down to the exit strategy. And then a third lesson that is really now in the making. It is the capacity to better de-risk these environments. For that, we need coalition of partners. We need also a diversity of partners who can take different risks, and this is really part of the future. And I will stop here. Over to you, Frederick.
Thank you so much, Fidi. No, I think these are really great examples, no, of how you think about these challenges and the solutions that we need to pursue. Daniel, over to you, please, to share your experience there in Burundi and currently in Burkina Faso, and also in general the work you do in relation to fragility in the bank, and the engagement that we have with the governments, and then also I think and the challenges that we face then also there at times. Please.
Thank you very much, Frederick. And I would like to add my voice to yours and to all the panelists to thank a lot IDEV for adding that point on the agenda, which is a very important one for fragile, or I would say transition states, and for our daily work, particularly for us working on those states. So for the benefit of the diversity of this panel, I'm going to switch in French and make my comments in French. Donc, je pense que Frédéric, par rapport à la question, tu as déjà facilité mon intervention, puisque je pense que tu as déjà posé le contexte de ce que la banque fait dans ces pays à travers donc la stratégie donc de la fragilité, de renforcement de la résilience et tout ce que la banque a eu à faire jusqu'ici. Et donc en termes de principes liés à la prévention, liés au partnership, liés au support au secteur privé. Et effectivement, nous, notre engagement sur le terrain s'inscrit en phase avec cette dynamique. Je voudrais juste peut-être articuler sur 2 points en ce qui concerne notre adaptation par rapport au contexte, par rapport au pays, au fait que nous vivons dans des contextes de plus en plus difficiles. et avec des situations parfois de conflits, de crises aiguës, et comment nous adaptons pour continuer à rester engagés, puisque c'est l'un des principes de la banque, notamment au niveau stratégique, c'est de demeurer engagé. Et maintenant, tout en s'entourant des assurances au niveau institutionnel et juridique, financier et fiduciaire, parce qu'il ne faut pas aussi que nous préservions ces conditions du point de vue de la banque. Mais ce principe de rester engagé répond effectivement aux besoins de ne pas obérer les progrès que les partenaires, les pays ont eu à faire et qui doivent être consolidés et justement renforcer la résilience dans ces pays. Donc, au niveau, par exemple, comme il me revient, moi, plus de donner la perspective de terrain, je donnerai l'exemple un peu du Burkina dans le cadre à la suite des crises politiques que nous avons eues en 2022, nous avons eu à adopter notre stratégie d'intervention pour la période 2022-2025, où nous avons effectivement décidé donc de répondre sur les défis à long terme, mais tout en mettant un accent aussi sur la réponse à court terme. Donc, il fallait trouver effectivement cet équilibre dans les interventions, parce que comme cela a été bien dit, il s'agit de renforcer la résilience, il s'agit de bâtir les perspectives, la solidité du pays pour le futur, lorsqu'on est dans une situation de fragilité, mais également il faut apporter des réponses à court terme. Et donc, à travers cela, il a été question donc de mettre l'accent sur des projets, sur des secteurs qui ont un fort impact sur la réduction de la fragilité, le renforcement de la résilience, notamment le secteur agricole, et également le secteur eau et assainissement, dont on sait que c'est une forte demande, notamment pour les personnes déplacées internes et les personnes vulnérables. Donc, il s'est agi pour nous de structurer notre intervention au niveau des secteurs donc, qui ont un fort impact au niveau donc, de renforcement de la résilience, tout en ciblant davantage les populations les plus vulnérables. Là également, je pense que les uns et les autres l'ont dit, à ce niveau, ce n'est peut-être pas nous, notre principal avantage comparatif, mais c'est là où il est important effectivement qu'on ait beaucoup plus de collaboration avec les agences comme les Nations Unies, mais également le ICRC, qui ont une empreinte, qui ont une meilleure connaissance peut-être du terrain, qui ont une présence plus large pour aider à travailler, à collaborer ensemble et à atteindre beaucoup plus ces cibles. Donc, je pense que du point de vue stratégique, c'est ceci, rester engagé et puis travailler et favoriser les secteurs et qui permettent donc d'atteindre le plus de personnes vulnérables. Mais en deuxième lieu, je pense qu'il y a également eu le besoin d'avoir des ajustements au niveau opérationnel, parce que lorsque vous intervenez dans des zones difficiles, dans des zones en situation d'insécurité, dans les zones difficiles d'accès, on ne peut pas ne pas intervenir dans ces zones, puisque ne pas y intervenir peut aussi exacerber les difficultés. Maintenant, comment s'ajuster? Je pense que c'est là toute la problématique. Donc, il a fallu donc, des approches appuyant davantage sur les populations locales. Je crois que à travers notamment l'approche territoriale intégrée, où nous mettons la mise en œuvre des projets en s'appuyant sur les structures locales, sur les structures décentralisées, pour vraiment atteindre ces zones les plus difficiles. Et je crois que ça également, c'est important, je pense que Margot l'a dit, le fait d'impliquer les populations locales, le fait d'impliquer les communautés locales permet une appropriation, une plus forte appropriation et peut-être peut permettre une meilleure réussite des projets. Et également, le partenariat, ce n'est pas seulement ce partenariat effectivement avec les structures locales, les OSC, etc., mais également au niveau des partenaires, je l'ai dit tantôt, donc dans ce qui concerne la mise en œuvre des opérations, que ce soit donc les structures des Nations Unies, les ONG internationales, pour pouvoir trouver des synergies ensemble dans la mise en œuvre des projets. Maintenant, un dernier point peut-être qui est intéressant et peut-être pour lequel nous avons été amenés à adapter, c'est que lorsque vous intervenez effectivement dans des zones difficiles d'accès, confrontés à des questions de sécurité, il nous faut de plus en plus donc prendre en compte cette dimension sécuritaire dans le montage de nos projets, ce qui n'était pas le cas avant, où voilà, nous avions des équipes classiques avec des fiduciaires, des spécialistes sectoriels. Maintenant, de plus en plus, il nous faut intégrer cette dimension sécurité à travers donc les équipes de gestion des projets, à travers un dialogue avec les autorités sur la sécurisation de nos interventions, à travers équipement, à travers également la mise en place de dotations pour les entreprises qui doivent intervenir sur ces zones pour sécuriser également leur domaine d'intervention, mais également en utilisant de plus en plus les outils technologiques qui sont à disposition pour une supervision à distance ou bien en relation avec les structures qui sont sur le terrain. Donc, voilà un peu de façon résumée quelques aspects de façon pratique que je voulais apporter par rapport à cette question donc, de stratégie d'intervention et d'adaptation dans le contexte de fragilité.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel, pour cette perspective, non, qui vraiment illustre non, ce qu'on essaye de faire à la banque sur le terrain. Hein, now I would like to build on this first exchange and then go back to you, Fidi, and just if you could share with us a little bit the experience that you have had as an institution, and I think you can also relate to this from your previous background working with development finance institutions. Like, we are trying to pursue basically an analytical approach to enhance the conflict sensitivity, fragility sensitivity in the design of our operations, all individually, and I think now also then when we do joint operations. Now, what is your experience when it comes to applying this type of analytical approach, no, at the design stage there, and also maybe the differences that we also see when humanitarian actors design a project, and compared to development actors when they design a project, and how can we bring these things together to also achieve synergies? I think for us, what we are realizing there is that at times there is the risk of focusing too much on the design and then not giving not enough attention to the implementation, particularly in these environments that are highly volatile. So yeah, if you could share your perspectives in this regard, please.
Thanks, Frederick. This is really a critical question, and really I think a point where evidence knowledge is key. In terms of design, I think it's important to acknowledge that in conflict settings, fragile settings, there is a very volatile environment, meaning that we need to remain very agile in implementing. And that requires a set of fiduciary flexibility that really have to be embedded from the onset. There's a second point I think that is important. It is the centrality of the protection dialogue with parties to the conflict, and this is really part of the innovative approach and innovative analytical approach that that I think will be part of the debate in the coming years. And here I'm really talking about the promotion of international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law, we call it so IHL, is a way to really make sure that we can hold parties to the conflict accountable and so that they respect, for example, that civilian infrastructures are not destroyed during conflict, and by doing that, you can really reduce the cost of war, reduce the cost of conflict. Then reduce the cost of recovery, and then really make sure that that we can go in the path toward development and then further down the line peace. So this is really key. And this is also something that that I think is particularly fitting in the African context. And here I'm really thinking, for example, about Sudan. It's a highly volatile conflict, increasingly urbanized, and really here I think that, for example, being sure that we can protect water infrastructure or hospitals is really at the core. So it's important that we think about that when we enter into the design, so that this can be taken also during implementation, and then further down, if we are able to scale up, if the needs change, if different regions have different needs. So we need that level of flexibility, and for that we need the access, and this is also what Respect for IHL can provide. This is our ability to continue delivering even in extremely degraded setups. And I think this is really part of the complementarity and the synergy that a principled humanitarian action and resilience building from development actors can achieve.
Thank you so much, Fidi, for this. I think this is the focus on agility in project implementation, so that there is a plan that is one thing and implementation is something else, and then also now the role of policy dialogue in these environments. I think this is very interesting to learn about these entry points to prevent conflict. Margot, please, over to you.
Thanks, Frederick. For WFP, we trying to adopt very deliberately the territorial approach, and then try to distinguish in this efforts to put the facility lens on the design of and the implementation of the programs into the sort of what we call them the buffer zones and the stable areas. And so in these buffer zones where we are, what we mean by buffer zones is those areas that are very close to the conflict areas, no? And so we're basically trying to prevent, if you want, spillover. I mean, it's of sort of the conflict area. So massively invest in these buffer zones in terms of the prevention and addressing protected needs, no? And that really means like the designing the pathways, the tiers chains and avoid the short-term measures in these areas. No. And then in the more I think the key principles that we're using in both the sort of the conflict areas and in the buffer zones to keep that fragility lens is and I think Fidi was mentioning some of them as well. Like first and foremost, I think it's a question of scale versus quality. So WFP is often at a large scale, but we cannot forget the quality aspects, and that's often more important than the scale. No, I think the second thing is around always have the conflict sensitivity analysis done in all of our programs in these very complex zones, so that we are really appropriately addressing what the issues are of the conflict, and that we are bringing social cohesion with our programs to the communities and help one way or another to address the root causes of the conflict. No, the third one is really around community participation and really taking the time to design and understand with the communities where and how and who will need to benefit from the programs, and really taking that as an essential step within it. Fourth is around the protection and accountability. We have a really strong drive towards accountability to the affected populations, and that includes that our programs needs to not compromise the protection of the individuals and the communities, but rather actually promotes the dignity, the protection, the safety, the integrity of the communities. And so there's strong efforts on that. There's also a strong effort in the humanitarian principles, and those are a bit under stress at the moment in many countries, as we know. So that requires discussions at all levels with a lot of patience and a lot of sort of maybe some of the reviews on what it means to protect that space for everyone in a principled manner. And then lastly, I think, and it was mentioned by Fidi, is around the flexibility. We need to be extraordinarily agile and flexible in the use of the resources and the design of the programs, because the situation is very fluid and does change very rapidly, and we need to be ready for that. So we really learned, I think, the participatory approach and the conflict sensitive design is a must. And then you need to measure it. It's nice to say you're doing it, but then you also need to measure whether what you've designed and what you do is actually having the intended impact. No, and so, for example, we have done studies with IFPRI and WFP in Niger and Burkina Faso, where we tested whether our resilience programs that had that in mind of this conflict sensitivity approach, if that was truly leading to an increased dialogue within the community, an increased social cohesion among the community. And we did see that it actually did reduce an enormous amount of tension in those communities. So then we build further upon those best practices. No, and it's really a matter of the dialogue and finding the right dialogue with all and everyone: the community leaders, the traditional leaders, the religious leaders, and try to create stronger bonds with our programs. I think the second thing that we really learned in the West Africa, and particularly in the Sahel, the conflict is very much related to natural resources, no? And the conflicts around natural resources is a massive one. And to avoid competition around these natural resources is why we are focusing so much on building these ecosystems, using water harvesting, using water retention, building the land, rehabilitating the land, which then we have also measured that again and did studies. Did this reduce the tension in the communities? Did it come back and gave us jobs for this community? Did it reduce the migration to some of the southern parts of the region? And indeed, we also saw that that was the case. So then we build upon best practices again. And I think lastly is that what we've seen is that we need to get a complaint feedback mechanisms from the communities and be really having that, and communities get more and more used to the idea that there is a line, there is a hotline, there is a way of complaining or coming with suggestions, and so there's a massive complaint feed mechanism tool in place in all of our programs, that we get the reactions directly from the individuals in the communities. So maybe also to mention, this is all good and well, but you need longer term resources for this. It's not a sort of a 1-year planning phase. So I think that's something that we need to work on all together in these fragile and volatile settings. I think it's also important to share the knowledge with other players much more deliberately, no? And I think we need to maybe build that knowledge and learning hub or something, and really make these lessons shared, but also that decisions are being made upon those good examples. And I think we do some of these assessments, but then we don't actually take the time to say, okay, what decision at what level is needed by all, and not just by WFP, for example, in the case of us having some of the lessons learned. No, so these are just some thoughts, Frederick, that come out from our work in these settings.
Yeah, thank you so much, Margaret. I think it's great to see basically these. I think these approaches that you take, and then they're not like with a territorial approach where you're very clear about your interventions and the conflict dynamics, and yeah, I think maybe now. Daniel, to hear a little bit from you about that, like how the bank basically then discusses or identifies its areas of engagement in this in these fragile situations from your experience, and what role then also their analytical work plays. Please.
Ok, merci Frédéric. Je pense que en ce qui concerne effectivement cette question, je pense que dans ton intervention également, tu en as fait part. De l'importance que nous accordons à l'analyse du prisme de la fragilité dans tous nos documents, que ce soit pour le document de stratégie pays, déjà qui fixe le cadre d'intervention de la banque dans le pays, où nous avons des instruments en place, notamment donc le Country Resilience Framework Assessment, qui contient un certain nombre d'indicateurs de suivi de la fragilité et du renforcement de la résilience, qui nous permettent vraiment de définir la façon dont nous devons adresser cette question de la fragilité et de la résilience dans le cadre de nos stratégies pays. Et je pense que c'est un travail important qui se fait en rapport avec tous les partenaires, mais particulièrement avec le gouvernement, parce que lorsqu'on parle des questions de fragilité, de sensibilité, d'analyse des facteurs de conflit, il faut vraiment avoir cet engagement avec le gouvernement pour effectivement avoir donc des analyses, on va dire, un peu partagées. Je crois que ça, c'est une donne, et je crois que c'est la même chose qui est appliquée également au niveau des projets pour nous assurer qu'il y a effectivement une prise en charge des éléments de fragilité. En termes de connaissances, comme vous le savez, nous produisons régulièrement, en tout cas on l'a fait ici, nous sommes en train de le faire au Burkina, nous l'avons fait au Burundi, généralement en prélude au document de stratégie pays, ce que nous appelons l'évaluation de la fragilité. Donc, qui est un document élaboré avec les différents partenaires pour justement avoir les inputs nécessaires qui nous permettent d'avoir un diagnostic beaucoup plus affiné et pouvoir adresser ainsi ces questions de fragilité dans nos stratégies et dans nos projets. Cela dit, ce n'est pas tout le temps simple également, parce que je pense qu'il y a des défis dans ce cadre. L'un des défis qui se pose le plus souvent, effectivement, c'est la disponibilité statistiques. Parce que généralement, dans ces pays, il y a non seulement les difficultés au niveau de l'appareil statistique pour avoir les informations les plus précises possibles sur les causes de fragilité. Lorsqu'on parle, par exemple, des questions de conflit entre comment dire, les éleveurs et les paysans, c'est généralement des données pour lesquelles c'est difficile de les documenter, alors qu'on sait que c'est une réalité qui est là et qu'il faut adresser. Parfois également, nous sommes dans un contexte où il faut traiter des données sensibles, des données confidentielles et pour lesquelles l'accès peut être difficile. Donc, ça nécessite un dialogue soutenu avec le gouvernement. Ça nécessite aussi un partenariat avec d'autres acteurs qui peuvent avoir un avantage comparatif à disposer des informations de cette nature, comme sur les personnes déplacées, etc., notamment avec les structures des Nations Unies. Donc, c'est vraiment la question qu'il faut avoir à l'esprit. Pour peut-être un dernier point, hein, c'est toujours dans ce contexte, bien que nous avons au cœur de notre activité les questions donc, de fragilité et de renforcement de la résilience, la BAD, les institutions comme la BAD n'ont pas cet avantage comparatif en matière d'analyse, par exemple, des facteurs de conflit, des facteurs d'insécurité. Bien entendu, il y a le volet développement, il y a le volet humanitaire sur lequel peut-être qu'il y a des éléments de diagnostic, mais il peut y avoir d'autres éléments beaucoup plus politiques pour lesquels il peut être difficile pour la banque d'avoir un diagnostic précis. Et c'est là, effectivement, qu'intervient cette nécessité, effectivement, de renforcer le partenariat avec des institutions comme le ICRC, comme Interpeace, comme certains centres de recherche, justement, pour trouver ensemble des éléments de diagnostic pour avoir une vue plus holistique qui permettra effectivement d'avoir une analyse plus poussée et des actions qui permettent donc de répondre dans la mesure du possible à ces questions donc de fragilité. Donc, juste renforcer donc cet partenariat autour de ces questions me paraît extrêmement important en plus de ce que nous faisons.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, for this. Yeah, I think this is how you highlighted how we at the bank are trying to apply this fragility lens both at the level of our country strategies and the individual operations, the challenges around data availability, and I think this then also it points us to explore like how we can approach better the joint analysis with different partners and also the continuous analysis because of the volatile situation there. So thank you so much for this. And I would now like to just stay with you for the next question. If you could elaborate a little bit on your views and also then how the bank engages around the role of the private sector in building resilience, and then supporting development in these fragile contexts. Please, Daniel.
Ok. Je pense que cette question, effectivement, c'est également un point critique dans le cadre de la stratégie de la banque. Je pense que c'est un des 3 piliers de la stratégie donc, sur la fragilité et la résilience de la banque. Et donc, nous au niveau des pays, nous efforçons vraiment de mettre en place, d'appuyer le cadre de développement du secteur privé, comme on le fait dans tous les pays, hein, mais particulièrement dans ces pays confrontés à la fragilité, justement pour sortir de la spirale fragilité des investissements du secteur privé, fragilité, parce que c'est une spirale et plutôt renverser la tendance pour aller vers résilience, plus d'investissement et plus de résilience encore. Donc, je pense que c'est un peu cette approche. Et à ce niveau, évidemment, il y a les outils classiques notamment pour aider à l'environnement du secteur privé à travers les appuis au niveau donc, du renforcement des infrastructures. On le sait, le cadre de développement du secteur privé, les infrastructures, le capital humain, notamment en permettant donc des programmes qui permettent de renforcer les synergies entre formation professionnelle et employabilité. Ici au Burkina, par exemple, nous venons d'approuver un projet multisectoriel de développement des compétences qui permet vraiment d'allier l'employabilité dans le milieu rural et avec justement l'agriculture et l'agro-industrie en vue donc de soutenir l'entrepreneuriat agricole, par exemple, dans ce secteur et de donner beaucoup plus de capacités. Il y a également les instruments financiers, parce que nous le savons, dans ces pays, il y a une perception justement du risque élevé. Et donc, nous devons avoir des instruments financiers adaptés pour juste permettre de dérisquer ou bien donc d'accompagner le risque qui est perçu à travers des garanties. Nous en avons plusieurs au niveau de la banque à travers donc l'affirmative des fonds spécifiques, notamment la AFAWA, qui appuie le financement dans des entrepreneurs au niveau des femmes pour leur activité. Nous avons également d'autres instruments de bonification du taux d'intérêt, notamment à travers donc le Private Sector Credit Enhancement Facility. Mais je pense que à côté de ces instruments financiers et de ces appuis pour le cadre de financement, le cadre de développement du secteur privé, il faut aussi il y a également d'autres leviers qui ne sont pas forcément financiers. Et à ce niveau, je pense que un des éléments importants, c'est peut-être le narratif qu'il faut porter sur ces pays. Parce que je parlais tout à l'heure d'un risque perçu qui est élevé pour ces pays, mais parfois qui peut être exagéré par rapport à ce qui se passe dans d'autres pays. Et là, je voudrais peut-être prendre les mots du président de la banque, Adesina, qui relevait effectivement que selon une étude de Moody's, montrait que l'Afrique est le pays où le défaut de risque sur les infrastructures est le plus faible. Lorsqu'on le compare l'Afrique, le continent africain, avec les pays européens, d'Amérique latine, de l'Amérique du Nord et d'Asie, un taux de défaut de paiement de 1,9% est constaté contre, par exemple, 12% en Europe de l'Est ou 10% en Amérique latine. Mais dans la perception, lorsque vous parlez donc d'Afrique et en particulier des pays fragiles, automatiquement, la perception du risque est élevée. Et c'est à ce niveau peut-être que aussi dans le narratif, nous, en tant qu'institution de financement, mais aussi en tant qu'institution de développement, nous devons aussi avoir donc un langage différent. Je dis toujours aux collègues, présentement, le Burkina Faso affiche l'un des meilleurs portefeuilles de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Alors que dans la perception, les choses ne marchent pas au Burkina Faso. Donc, c'est la même expérience. Quand j'étais au Burundi, à chaque fois que je donnais les résultats en ce qui concerne la conduite des projets, la conduite des programmes, c'était vraiment meilleur que la moyenne dans les autres pays, et parfois la perception est différente ailleurs. Un autre aspect également, je pense, qui est important aussi, c'est l'assistance technique et la présence sur le terrain des partenaires, des structures, des partenaires pour appuyer, renforcer les capacités pour le développement du secteur privé. Au niveau de la banque, je pense que nous avons commencé à comprendre cela en déployant de plus en plus donc des NSO, NSO spécialistes sur les pays confrontés à ces cas de fragilité. Je donne l'exemple de l'Afrique centrale. Et là, je reprends les mots du directeur général de la Banque pour l'Afrique centrale, qui, lors des travaux sur l'annual work planning, se réjouissait qu'avec la présence d'un spécialiste du secteur privé dans la région Afrique centrale, il a été en mesure d'identifier un pipeline de projets du secteur privé de 1 milliard de dollars. Alors qu'avant, c'était quasiment, le portefeuille était quasiment vide à ce niveau. Donc, la présence, l'engagement avec le secteur privé sur le terrain, leur expliquer les instruments, les possibilités et apporter une assistance technique, je pense que c'est critique à ce niveau. Et puis, peut-être un avant-dernier point, c'est pas, je le disais tantôt, c'est faire en sorte aussi que le secteur privé soit part de la solution pour réduire la fragilité. Et c'est là où je pense que, comme on le disait tout à l'heure, faire de plus en plus recours aux PME, aux petites entreprises, aux entreprises locales pour l'exécution de certaines activités au niveau des régions où il est peut-être difficile d'accès. Elles sont là-bas, elles ont la connaissance du terrain, elles peuvent prendre en charge ces travaux et je pense que ça contribue à les renforcer et également promouvoir. Lorsqu'on parle de responsabilité sociale des entreprises, pourquoi ne pas y rajouter également cette question de la prise en charge d'un secteur privé qui donnerait aussi parfois une priorité aux personnes vulnérables, aux personnes déplacées internes, en les recrutant, en les intégrant dans les entreprises, en favorisant leur intégration. Je pense qu'il nous faut aussi voir cette perspective. Peut-être qu'on ne l'a pas souvent fait, mais de voir comment faire en sorte qu'aussi le secteur privé soit aussi un acteur clé dans la réponse qu'il faut apporter au niveau humanitaire, même en plus du développement. Donc voilà un peu quelques réflexions que je voulais partager sur cette question.
Thank you so much, Daniel, really for illustrating the role of the private sector and and also for demystifying basically some of the assumptions about what it can do and how and whether risks are real or perceived. I think you have made a very clear case that we have to systematically look at the role of the private sector from the perspective of a development finance institution, because this is also one of our comparative advantages, and we do have instruments to do that we can then also bring to these environments. Now, Fidi, I would like to learn a little bit from you how you, as a humanitarian actor, look at the private sector in these in these environments. Please, over to you.
Thanks, Frederick, and thanks, Daniel, for showing that that things are possible, and this is really also our perspective. So, in conflicts really vary, but there's one thing that is true everywhere and that we see is that the private sector and local actors are much quicker in responding than any international organization on its own. That being said, we have also to acknowledge that the most vulnerable are often excluded from productive activities and from local markets, and this is especially true when it comes to fragile settings. So we really have to acknowledge both realities, and this is really central to our approach when it comes to improve people's ability to generate income. And really, even further to this point, I would say that when it comes to our work around economic security of affected populations, the RCRC really adopts a dual approach. So one is focusing on the household level, because really need to help vulnerable families to start or restart income generating activities. And second, it's also important to intervene at the systemic level. And by doing that, it means to work to really improve the functioning and people's access to local markets. And really both approaches are really rooted in analysis, knowledge of the local markets, the identification of the needs, and this is really building on a consistent interaction with the local private sector. And that takes us back to also the protracted nature of conflicts, to be present in these fragile settings for a longer time. This really helps us actually really understand what the development sector and the global private sector calls frontier markets. And this is the second part of the approach on private sector, is really as part of this coalition of partners that we're building around sustainable impact. An example, for example, is really in the water services in Goma, in DRC, where ICRC has been investing really seed money to be able to connect the water systems in Goma, and then we had private sector partners coming in with some grant elements, taking the risk, and then also helping to de-risk for others. And I think Eastern DRC is really an interesting case because of the nature of the conflict. If we didn't have those actors coming with us when the intensity of the conflict was lower, then today I think we would have had less capacity to respond to the emergency needs. So this is also one of the lessons around the nexus, is that it's not only about exit, it is also about building preparedness and response capacity.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fidi. I think this is also it's great to see how a humanitarian actor basically already faces puts a focus on then what you call economic security. It's the income generating activities at that at level, whereas we basically as a development finance institution, then now we look at it from the perspective of micro, small, medium-sized enterprises, and then basically to generate synergies around this. Margot, please, over to you to share WFP's approach and your experience in this regard.
Thank you, Frederick, and thank you very much, Daniel and Fidi, to give these examples, and Daniel to really set the stage on the de-risking and the attraction, of course. As WFP, we work a lot with the private sector, obviously, and as Fidi said, I mean, whether it's for transporting, whether it's for buying, we're trying to really buy all our foods in the country where we operate, storage, transformation of the foods, fortification of the foods. So it's a whole value chain approach where the private sector is obviously core. But I'd like the way Daniel also described it. I mean, we haven't, I think, totally unlocked the risk factor, of course, that is seen, but also to find the the models and the strategies that speak to the objectives of both, on the private sector, of course, on the sort of the productive and the competitive angle, and then from the development angle to actually have a proof of concept that is good for the business and good for the development. And I think that's where, I mean, I always get inspired by Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School on this shared value. And I mean, really getting and unlocking that, I think is what would really help us yet another level forward, no, in this environment, and get both the economic and social conditions enhanced, and then an interest in a competitive environment for a company that wants to expand further. Now, for us in the area of where we really work very hard, and also with the bank, trying to look for how do we strengthen the food value chains? How do we strengthen the resilient food system agenda? No, and in these fragile centers, all of the governments want food sovereignty, want to work towards less imports, more transformation of the raw materials, etc. in country. And that's of course directly also of interest to World Food Programme. Now, if we want to buy locally, we often need to work through that value chain. So a few examples that I think, I mean, the elephant valley in Mali is a good example where I think they are supporting the farmers and the farmer cooperatives with providing access inputs, and then guaranteeing productivity and the offtake, no, of the offtake market. So it reduces the pressure on the public financing, and it replaces sort of the subsidies in a way. So this is a small example maybe, but it's a model that works. No, and in other countries we see other similar models. In Ghana, Tanzania, we see similar models. What we also trying to look for more is the blended financing as another strategy. We have some examples of public, private, and philanthropic investments to mobilize then larger capitals for projects. Now, we've done some of this blended financing in the agribusiness industry, for example, in Ghana, where private sector comes in with some of the investments for equipment, some of the support to the medium. I'm talking medium scale businesses here. No, I'm not talking the big scale, but the medium scale, to improve the production of nutritious foods for Ghana and for some of the social programs in Ghana, but also for WFP to buy and even export to some of our other programs. So we de-risking the investment from the private sector in these types of companies, because there is a market and an offtake for the business. No, so I think these are good examples that are addressing nutritious problems. They are addressing the lack of fortified foods available in some of these countries, and they encourage private sector investments, and are sort of modeling that in such a way that the risk is reduced in a sense. No, so I think on the we really needing to try to find more of those models in the area of the bringing the resilience of the food systems back in the countries we operate in. And on that note, if I may, Frederick, just do a plea for the African Development Bank. We were asked by the Deputy Secretary General to go around in the 3 Central Sahel countries and sort of recreate the dialogue and recreate the trust, and ask what are the objectives of the government that they see the UN sort of much more coming together on, and get to a larger scale transformative program with an impact and actions on the ground. And the resilient food systems for all was one that came out in all of the 3 countries. And hence the Deputy Secretary General has asked us to really come together and see what's already done, what are the investments already done, what is the impact of those investments, what is the private sector doing, what are the international financial institutions doing, what is the UN doing, and what are the civil society doing, and really come with an investment plan, actually taking into account the ongoing, but also what's maybe missing. And having the African Development Bank part of this thinking and of this process would majorly help the co-creation with the governments, the co-creation with the institutionals, financial institutions, and the co-creation with the private sector, I think. So just sorry for the plea, but that would maybe help us all forward, particularly the governments and the populations in the Central Sahel.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I think this is really, it's really great to see how also not a humanitarian actor there adopts a value chain approach and and actively considers now the not then the role of the private sector. And I think this blended finance approach that's great. And no, we will be very happy to work with you around now building this food systems resilience, because we, as an institution, Feed Africa is now one of our high fives, and it's an area of comparative advantage. The continent as a whole still has is importing about $30 billion in foodstuffs annually, and so we need to reduce that that food dependency. And I think particularly we've seen now in the case of our Technologies for African Agriculture Transformation program, TAD, that invests in enhancing the not really the productivity of seeds, making them climate resilient. That this can have a major impact in these conflict affected environments. A case in point is Sudan right now, where we're working also with WFP around an emergency wheat production project that then builds on the research and development that had been done thanks to TAD with improved seed varieties, and right now is actually increasing yields in Sudan, where there is a growing food insecurity crisis. No, and I think so. We do need to invest in technology, and we do need to invest in these regional value chains as well. And I think this is an area where that it really becomes clear how humanitarian and development actors can collaborate. Now, I'm mindful of time, that we still have 15 minutes before we open it up for Q&As, and I would now like to combine two questions for each of you, and you will therefore each have some 5 minutes for that. So the one element is really about the partnerships. I think we've talked now a lot about this there, and I think like now this is I would like to hear from all of you, like what it is that that we should be doing there going forward. Now, I think we've heard now very concrete examples, like from Margaret there. I think we've also heard an example from FIDI now in Goma, how humanitarian development actors can come together. We've talked about the role of the private sector as well. But now I also would like you to reflect a little bit on the role of civil society organizations in this context as well. So how can we build these nexus partnerships, and then what is the role of civil society in this, and how can we strengthen that? And then in this context also, just if you can reflect on not on the role then of independent evaluation again, because I think we they have brought us together here, and sometimes I think like we do have these evaluations that focus a lot on our individual institutions, no? But we do need to have also, I think, these evaluations that look at our partnerships, how we are working as a system, and the progress that we are making as a system, and how we can bring all of our institutions together to make progress on that. Now, what are the lessons? What is the experience now on that? So yeah, maybe FIDI, if you could start us off with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Frederick. So, very challenging question, but at the same time, I think this is really the right one for us to reflect on. This is I think a very timely moment to do things differently and to really build on what has worked. On your first question on how do we build a coalition of partners to create a greater leverage, greater synergy, and what is it that we can expect from that? I would really see three things. First is the complementarity of the mandates to really address complexity. I think we are navigating very difficult times. There is a paradigm shift that is needed across the board. This is relevant for financing, of course, but also on, for example, and this is a question that ACRC we are really asking ourselves, what neutral intermediary means in the contemporary interpretation of conflict. Second point is really the question on how coalition of partners can ensure sustainability of the impact and also the inclusion of the communities. And this is where having civil society as part of this conversation is really key. For example, I really see that there are greater consultations, MDBs have dedicated platforms, and I think this is really going in the right direction. And then a third point, we mentioned this, but I think we need to be able to provide greater de-risking when it comes to exiting from humanitarian situations. And I think there's really a great effort across the board that is needed to make sure that, for example, grant resources can be made available to make sure that these phases, critical phases, can be addressed with the right instruments. And then on the second question around the role of evaluation and knowledge, I think this is really part of the partnership engineering that is needed, and then how the different elements can feed into each other. For example, us as CRC, when we engage and when we work with development actors, we build long-term partnerships. On the one hand, really focusing on operational partnerships, because this is where you can achieve the impact. This is where we get our systems to reconcile and where we can innovate. But at the same time, we need to clearly invest the policy conversation. This is true when it comes to climate and how this intersects with the need for resources to reach fragile settings and even within fragile countries where the needs are the most acute, meaning where conflicts are really present. And that is only possible if we are able to generate knowledge on both fronts, from the operational and financial side, but also that can feed into the policy conversation. And this is a part of, I would not say a plea, but part of what we really look forward to with the bank. How can we better inform the review of the strategies? This is a contribution that we've made with other MDBs and really learned also ourselves on how we can work better together. There are also the replenishment cycles, I think, of the MDBs that are important moments where this knowledge can really help governance boards and the countries represented there to work towards that paradigm shift.
Thank you so much, Fidi. I very much like the focus on a paradigm shift and to approach these partnerships, more strategically, so that they really come together as institutions and not just transactionally. And then how really knowledge is key in that context. So, Margot, please, over to you.
Thank you, Frederick, and once again, thanks for self-questioning yourself and the bank, and giving this opportunity for this discussion, and sort of truly reaching out and trying to find solutions with us. I think it helps us all, and I think it needs to be done by all. So I think you set yet again the bar very high for us all, and I really appreciate that. So I think I won't say, I think there's a few minutes only left now. So let me just say, civil society for us is absolutely key, no? And we are having to go from a transactional partnership into a true partnership. And that means, truly building the capacities, but also building anything that they do know and have as a capacity into our programs. And I think that's really our struggle here. And for long, we have seen them as a transactional partner. So really, I think I wanted to insist also on building the local capacities at all levels. Civil society, local civil society, but also locally research institutions, work with researchers and think tanks and communities from the countries, from the regions, that I think we work, for example, with 12 universities in the Sahel, and they are part of our evaluations, and they are part of students that are doing master studies. They are part of bringing workers, let's say, into the program. So I think we have a lot to do there to make sure that the capacity, civil society, but local institutions and research structures are having what it takes to be truly the partner. It needs to come from there, and it will stay there, and it's the most sustainable way. And just on the evaluation, I think we trying hard as WFP, but we have still a long way to go to get the impact measurements right, to do the real-time evaluation, to use all of the innovative tools that are out there, including artificial intelligence, including geospatial analysis that are out there. So the real time, I think, is important. Also, the participatory evaluations with the communities is key, is crucial. The evaluations on how to do end emergency and longer term together and get still the results for both is important. I think we have plenty of evidence of what goes well, but I do think we have a problem with decisions being taken on the good or the bad of a program. No, so in the case of the resilience program, it's a large-scale one in the Sahel. It has very good results. There needs to be policy decisions taken on the good results, no, or vice versa. So that I think is still a bit of a challenge. And I really think we need to do more of bringing the generation of knowledge together for decision making, for a set of priorities that we have as a common vision together. So on that note, and with more of these seminars, Frederick, I think we'll get there. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Margaret. I think this is really also this helps us also really refine our approaches, and I like also these examples like that you work with then local universities then around that, now the building the capacities, and then just having knowledge that helps us scale up impact, no? Build on what works, and then also that knowledge that is directed to then not just one actor, but to various actors, to that coalition of partnership. Yeah, I think these are all elements that we need to try to pursue together. Daniel, please, over to you.
Oui, merci beaucoup, Frédéric, et merci à Margot et à Fidi pour m'avoir facilité la tâche, parce que je pense qu'avec leurs interventions, ils ont couvert déjà beaucoup de points, donc je ne serai pas long sur cette question, mais juste pour dire pour le partenariat, revenir sur un point. En ce qui concerne le partenariat entre les différents acteurs, comme la société civile, un élément qui est important pour moi, c'est toujours d'avoir le gouvernement en question sur le driver seat. Lorsqu'on a un gouvernement qui pilote un cadre, qui pilote un programme et qui peut organiser les partenaires, que ce soit tout type de partenaires autour de ce même document, je pense que la coordination est plus simple. Que lorsque voilà, chacun a sa stratégie et essaie de voir comment tirer profit. Et ça nous ramène à la question à l'initiative, le New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States. Je pense que l'idée, c'était ça, d'avoir des gouvernements qui ont leur propre stratégie contre la fragilité pour la résilience et donc de fédérer les partenaires qui viennent soutenir cela. Bon, peut-être qu'il y a lieu de revoir la mise en œuvre. Qu'est-ce qui n'a pas bien marché et comment faire pour améliorer cela. Je pense que c'est peut-être là un domaine aussi pour lequel peut-être IDEV aussi pourrait regarder cela, mais peut-être avec les autres partenaires. Mais je pense que ce principe vraiment d'avoir le gouvernement sur le drive site pour coordonner est important. Maintenant, il est vrai que ce n'est pas tout le temps possible, surtout lorsqu'on est dans une situation de conflit où il n'y a pas un gouvernement proprement parlé, où il faut effectivement nous organiser. Et je pense que le partenariat est toujours de mise. Nous avons tous des cadres où nous pouvons nous retrouver de concertation, pour coordonner nos actions et favoriser effectivement ce nexus humanitaire, développement et paix. Je donne l'exemple dans le cas du Sahel avec l'Alliance Sahel que nous avions eu. Bon, peut-être le contexte géopolitique a un peu mis en mal le mécanisme, mais qui a fonctionné dans un cadre et qui a permis de réunir, en tout cas au niveau du Sahel, plusieurs acteurs et de permettre donc le développement, donc la mise en œuvre de ce nexus entre partenaires. Les organisations de la société civile, bien entendu, c'est un partenaire important pour nous aussi là-bas. Nous avons comme l'un des acteurs d'implémentation, en tout cas de partenariat dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de nos projets. Mais comme on le sait, la banque opère de façon essentiellement à travers donc la structure étatique et à charge donc à la structure étatique donc d'impliquer ces organisations de la société civile. Mais comme je l'ai dit tantôt dans mon intervention, leur apport est de plus en plus important et de plus en plus requis, surtout pour l'accès à des zones les plus difficiles où elles ont une présence déjà et elles connaissent le terrain et peuvent aider dans la mise en œuvre de ces projets. Donc, en termes de connaissances pour IDEV, je pense que j'ai parlé de New Deal, de voir un peu comment renforcer la prise en compte du prisme de la fragilité dans les pays. Pour moi, c'est important que les pays eux-mêmes le fassent. C'est vrai que certains pays ne veulent pas se définir comme fragiles. Mais bon, voilà, il faut trouver notre narratif pour que ça soit effectivement une question prise en compte dans les programmes. Et je pense aussi voir en termes de métriques, en termes de résultats, est-ce qu'il ne faut pas un autre cadre d'évaluation des résultats lorsqu'on intervient dans les pays fragiles? Est-ce que nous devons toujours nous limiter aux données métriques, ou bien est-ce qu'il y a un autre narratif, notamment sur les conflits drivers, les drivers des conflits? Et je pense que c'est là où Frédéric parlait ce matin, en introduction, des intended results, donc l'impact attendu, notamment sur la paix, puisque jusqu'ici, nous sommes beaucoup intervenus, mais sans pour autant cibler clairement la paix et la sécurité. Et donc, comment nous devons travailler à avoir donc des cibles très claires, très précis sur ces questions. Je pense que ça aussi, c'est un domaine où nous avons besoin de plus de connaissances et donc beaucoup plus d'emphase. Merci.
Yeah, thank you so much, Daniel, no, and also not really for highlighting no, the role of the government in as an basically to help coordinate the HDP nexus, because we to the extent that this is possible, but I think this is absolutely the right entry point for all of it, because we do see some limitations within the system of all of the different actors coordinating with each other. Ultimately, this has to be coordinated at the national level, and I think this is also this was really the experience, not at the approach of the New Deal for Engagement, Fragile State, and we need to take the lessons from this there and see like what it is that we want to do differently going forward, because also that I fully agree with you now that like everybody doing its own analysis of the situation, well, it would be like we need to look at having a common understanding, and even have that common understanding as much as possible, reaching that consensus around the situation, how to look at it with the government, because ultimately we are there to support the government and there, now in to the extent that it's possible. And I think also there, not a refreshing look at like what are indicators for results, how do we define results ourselves, and maybe is it possible for us to really start monitoring all these things a little bit better than as a system? And maybe there is also then the independent evaluation offices of our various institutions could also possibly collaborate to do something innovative around that there. So yeah, there's a lot of food for thought here. And just now, also before opening it up to questions, also just to remind everyone that this discussion is really one that will also now inform not the midterm review of our strategy for addressing fragility and building resilience. So we very much welcome not just this rich debate, but then also not the questions and recommendations that you have not for all of that. So with that, I would like to pass it to my colleagues at the Independent Evaluation Office to facilitate now the Q&A session. Jane, Raki, please.
Yes, now we go to the Q&A session, and we have actually a couple of questions ready in the room. But Raki will help us with questions coming online. So what I'll suggest, let's start with colleagues in the room. I will hand it over to Clément. I think you had a question.
Allô, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis Clément Bancé. Je suis chargé d'évaluation en chef au niveau du département de l'évaluation indépendante de la banque. Je voudrais commencer mon intervention par saluer vraiment la qualité des intervenants, notamment au niveau de la note introductive de Frédéric, mais également la qualité des interventions des panélistes qui nous ont permis en tout cas d'avoir un aperçu de comment est-ce que les questions de fragilité sont intégrées dans leurs interventions. Et j'ai apprécié également les expériences pratiques de terrain que Daniel a partagées avec nous, que je trouvais vraiment très intéressantes. Alors, mon intervention, disons que je vais faire une petite contribution avant de poser une question à Daniel pour avoir davantage les perspectives de terrain. Alors, il faut dire que j'ai eu l'opportunité de conduire les équipes d'évaluation de la banque sur la stratégie de la fragilité de la BAD, mais également sur la facility. Il faut dire que c'était un exercice comportait beaucoup de défis, mais qui nous ont permis, en tout cas avec la collaboration du département de la fragilité de la banque, de pouvoir clairement démontrer les points forts, les points faibles de la banque en termes de prise en compte des questions de fragilité au niveau stratégique, mais également au niveau opérationnel, de tirer des leçons et de formuler des recommandations pouvant aider la banque à aller de l'avant dans ce sens. C'est le lieu pour moi, en tout cas, de saluer la collaboration du département de la fragilité de la banque qui nous a permis en tout cas de faire en sorte que les résultats d'une évaluation puissent informer les stratégies et les opérations de la banque. Je crois que c'est un très bon exemple ici qui nous montre l'utilité de l'évaluation et comment est-ce que les résultats d'une évaluation peuvent informer nos stratégies et nos opérations au sein de la banque. Et le résultat de tout ça, c'est quoi? Alors, quand nous regardons les performances des projets de la banque, nous constatons à nos jours que la tendance est que nos opérations sont plus performantes dans les pays fragiles comparées aux pays FAT. Et j'ai eu une discussion avec nos collègues de la Banque mondiale sur cette question et aussi ils ont fait ce même constat. Alors, c'est dire que nos différentes institutions continuent à apprendre, à s'adapter et à mieux travailler dans des contextes de fragilité. Et ça, c'est le message clé que nous devons avoir, savoir que nous devons continuer, même si des défis demeurent, nous devons continuer, nous sommes dans la bonne direction et cela nous montre comment est-ce que, en tout cas, l'évaluation est utile et comment est-ce que dans une institution, si les résultats d'évaluation, le processus a été inclusif, on a impliqué nos collègues des opérations et à la fin du processus, les résultats de l'évaluation sont acceptés par le management de la banque, voici ce que ça donne comme résultat. Donc, nous, en tant qu'évaluateurs, nous ne pouvons que saluer cela. Cela montre l'utilité de notre travail. Alors, il y a eu un aspect qui est revenu notamment dans l'intervention de Daniel, qui se posait la question, est-ce que devons-nous continuer à... Est-ce que n'est-il pas opportun de réfléchir sur le cadre de l'évaluation dans les contextes de fragilité? Est-ce qu'il faut pas réfléchir, trouver une autre façon d'évaluer les performances au niveau du contexte de fragilité? Je crois que ça, c'est un point très important. Nous réfléchissons sur ce domaine. Également, j'ai eu à échanger avec des collègues d'autres institutions sur ce problème. Et la réflexion est en cours. Mais en attendant, il faut se dire qu'en matière d'évaluation, on évalue ce qu'on a prévu de faire dans les pays. OK? Il faut dire que à travers la prise en compte, et le point de départ, c'est quoi? C'est la conception de nos stratégies opérations au niveau des pays fragiles. Et notamment la question centrale qui fait l'objet des discussions aujourd'hui, la prise en compte de prismes de fragilité. Et si l'analyse qui a été faite pour identifier les facteurs de fragilité était correcte et son application a été bien faite au niveau tant stratégique qu'opérationnel, en principe, les objectifs qu'on se fixe dans les pays fragiles doivent être objectifs, réalistes, mais également les conditions de mise en œuvre doivent être en tout cas adaptées au contexte du pays. Donc, nous, en tant qu'évaluateurs, on ne fera que s'assurer, vérifier si les objectifs qu'on s'est fixés dans le cadre de ces pays-là ont été atteints ou pas. Sinon, quels sont les facteurs qui ont impacté là-dessus. Donc, voici un peu la contribution que je voulais apporter à cette réflexion. Mais en tant qu'évaluateur, nous restons ouverts pour voir est-ce que, évidemment, y a-t-il pas lieu de voir comment est-ce qu'on peut mieux mettre en place un cadre adapté pour l'évaluation dans des contextes de fragilité. Alors, maintenant, je vais aborder la question que j'avais, parce qu'en tant qu'évaluateur, nous, ce qui nous intéresse surtout, c'est l'expérience de terrain. C'est bon d'avoir de bonnes stratégies, mais c'est encore mieux de voir comment est-ce que tout cela se pratique sur le terrain. Alors, l'un des principes, et je crois que Daniel l'a bien souligné, c'est de demeurer en tout cas engagé dans le pays, malgré les difficultés. Et sur ce plan, il faut saluer les efforts de la banque. Et je crois que jusque-là, la banque tente de renforcer en tout cas sa présence sur le terrain. Comment est-ce qu'on peut être proche des acteurs? Comment est-ce qu'on peut être sur le terrain pour mieux comprendre le contexte et comment est-ce qu'on peut intégrer ce contexte-là dans nos opérations et dans nos stratégies. Donc ça, c'est une bonne chose. Deuxièmement, la banque a mis les incitations en place pour encourager ses meilleurs staffs à résider dans les pays difficiles pour vraiment aider à améliorer ces opérations, ces interventions dans le terrain. Et le résultat, c'est ce que nous avons constaté. Un autre aspect, c'est le renforcement du partenariat. D'accord? Et ça, c'est revenu à plusieurs reprises. Nous savons que les questions de fragilité, il y a des aspects où la banque n'a pas d'avantage comparatif. Et je crois que Daniel est revenu là-dessus. Quand je prends l'exemple de la sécurité, nous avons vu que la banque n'a pas un avantage comparatif par rapport à d'autres partenaires. Et à ce niveau, ça montre comment est-ce que, si nous devons avoir une analyse holistique de la situation, comment est-ce que nous devons travailler avec d'autres partenaires. Donc, ma question, c'est spécifique à la zone l'Afrique de l'Ouest, particulièrement au Burkina. Nous avons vu qu'au niveau régional, la situation est assez dynamique. En lien avec comment est-ce que la banque s'adapte dans ce genre de contexte-là. Je voudrais, je ne sais pas si Daniel peut partager avec nous, nous savons actuellement que le Burkina, le Mali, le Niger ont constitué un nouveau groupe, une confédération qu'on appelle l'AES. Ils ont quitté la CEDEAO. Et nous savons que dans le contexte de l'intervention de la banque, il y a des projets régionaux qui sont en cours, d'autres en phase d'instruction. Alors, dans ce contexte régional dynamique, comment est-ce que la banque adapte son intervention pour, en tout cas, continuer à exister, à intervenir et à produire des résultats? Ça, c'est la première question. Au niveau partenarial, nous savons, à travers nos évaluations, on a vu que des fois, bien sûr, dans des contextes où certains partenaires ont des avantages comparatifs avec la banque, il arrive des fois que la banque oriente ses opérations vers d'autres agences, peut-être des Nations Unies ou des organisations de la société civile pour certaines interventions. Et des fois, il y a des difficultés, je ne sais pas. Sur la base de son expérience au Burundi et au Burkina Faso, est-ce que il y a eu des exemples pratiques de ce genre où la banque a dû léguer partie de ses ressources à d'autres agences pour, en tout cas, qui ont un avantage plus comparatif qu'elle pour atteindre des résultats sur le terrain? Je vous remercie.
Federica, would you like for us to take another question? My colleague was not only asking questions, but also he made very good interventions. Is there another question there?
Yeah, let's take a round of questions, and it helps, just like Clément, if the speaker can identify the person to whom he wants to address the question. Obviously, I'm also available to answer questions.
Okay.
Bonjour, je suis Jean-François Yao, je suis le conseiller principal du Comité international de la Croix-Rouge basé à Abidjan, à la délégation régionale. Donc moi, c'est aussi plus des commentaires. Avant tout propos, je voudrais remercier l'ensemble des intervenants pour leurs pertinentes perspectives qui ont eu l'avantage de nous dresser le tableau des interventions de la Banque africaine dans le cadre des contextes fragiles en conflit et en haute situation de violence. Pour ma part, vu que j'ai l'insigne honneur de gérer de façon locale le partenariat entre la Banque africaine de développement et le Comité international de la Croix-Rouge, comme l'a si bien rappelé mon collègue Fidi, les questions relatives à l'évaluation des projets sont, on va dire, au cœur des discussions que nous avons, justement, dans le cadre des négociations qui ont abouti à la finalisation de l'accord cadre de partenariat. Et dans le cadre justement de ce partenariat, nous avions eu à initier un projet pilote au niveau du Sahel, projet d'autonomisation des femmes. Et la question de l'évaluation a été à un moment donné un point d'achoppement, justement parce que c'était deux structures avec des cahiers de charges et des règles assez rigides. Et je remercie au passage l'ensemble des intervenants qui ont souligné le fait que justement dans le cadre du partenariat, il faudra avoir une certaine agilité, une flexibilité dans la mise en œuvre. Et je rejoins un peu les propos de mon prédécesseur, M. Bansé, qui a appelé justement l'attention de savoir quel serait le meilleur point d'ancrage justement de ces partenariats-là dans l'atteinte des objectifs assignés à la mise en œuvre des projets conjoints. Et je me réjouis que justement dans le cadre de ce partenariat, la dimension, on va dire, non quantifiable qu'a relevé M. Daniel Ndoye sur la possibilité que nous avons à travers ce partenariat avec la Banque africaine d'élargir le champ d'évaluation, de la grille d'évaluation sur des domaines que je dirais insaisissables, comme le droit international humanitaire, qu'a si bien relevé mon collègue Fidi, et qui est en cours d'étude et d'intégration justement dans la grille d'évaluation au niveau de la BAD. Et je souscris totalement pour que, comme l'a dit M. Bansé, la réflexion soit poussée de sorte à... Je me réjouis déjà des contacts que vous avez au sein des banques multilatérales de développement, aussi bien que des autres partenaires, pour approfondir justement cette question et mettre les équipes d'évaluation. Par exemple, chez nous, c'est le département Analyse and Evidence, les rapprocher les deux départements à l'effet justement de sortir un cadre qui permettrait justement, dans le cadre des évaluations de nos projets conjoints, de, si vous voulez, essayer de plus parler le même langage et faciliter les recommandations, surtout les lessons learned, comme nous avons pu bénéficier justement de la mise en œuvre du premier projet Sahel. Et là, nous sommes justement en train de préparer un autre projet pour le Soudan et qui justement s'adosse sur les lessons learned de l'évaluation de ces 10 projets. Donc voilà ce que j'avais à dire comme contribution et remercier en tout cas tous les collègues du département IDEV que je rencontre pour la première fois. Et j'espère que dans le cadre de notre collaboration, nous aurons encore l'occasion de nous retrouver. Je remercie Frédéric, Margot et M. Ndoye encore une fois pour les interventions. Merci.
Okay, thank you. One more question. Pablo, did you have a question? Okay.
Just very quickly, hello everyone. I'm Pablo Cordova from UNHCR. I have a question more for Fidi, I think. So Fidi, you mentioned the need for flexibility in funding, and Margot mentioned the challenges that we have in measuring impact, real-time measurement, and piggybacking on the intervention from Clément that mentioned that we measure what is intended, sometimes what is not intended as well. Given this flexibility in fragile context, I was wondering if you think that tailoring perhaps evaluations more in a scenario planning phase where evaluation support outlining what are the possible options in terms of scenarios and help supporting the interventions in the depending on the scenario that we are facing is something where evaluations as a tool generating evidence should be strengthened or not. And if you think this is a way forward. Thank you. I hope it was clear.
Okay, so maybe over to Daniel to respond to the first question that came from Clément. And then the others can also pick some of the questions that came from the other two participants. Thank you.
Merci, Jen. Merci beaucoup, Clément, et aux collègues aussi pour les questions. Par rapport à l'intervention de Clément, je pense que Clément, il faut qu'on pense à le mener, à le décentraliser maintenant dans les pays fragiles avec son expérience, toute l'expérience qu'il a accumulée. Je pense que ce serait vraiment très utile sur le terrain. En tout cas, ses commentaires sont très pertinents et donc effectivement ça reflète là l'importance du knowledge avec la connaissance accumulée dans le cadre de l'évaluation justement de la fragilité, du document de fragilité également de la facilité sur lequel aussi nous avons beaucoup puisé. Bon, enfin, c'est lorsque quelqu'un connaît très bien aussi, il pose des questions difficiles. Donc, et des questions difficiles dans le contexte des pays du Sahel. Effectivement, c'est pertinent de se poser la question par rapport à l'intervention de la banque. Mais je dirais que d'une manière générale, ce que je peux dire, il est vrai que les projets, certains projets régionaux peuvent avoir nécessité des réaménagements, puisque nous avons, particulièrement dans la région de l'Afrique de l'Ouest, quelques projets qui étaient peut-être mis en œuvre sous la tutelle de la CEDEAO, et il y a des composantes probablement qui pourraient nécessiter un réajustement. Il y a par exemple des projets énergie, de West African Power Pool, il y a également des projets d'interconnexion de routes, des projets peut-être qui sont exécutés par des instances de la CEDEAO, comme ici nous en avons ici avec le projet dans le secteur de la santé qui est exécuté par l'OAS qui est l'organisation de l'institution de la CEDEAO en charge des programmes de santé et qui pourrait peut-être nécessiter des réaménagements, mais je pense que la discussion, c'est en cours, c'est toujours maintenu avec les pays afin de voir est-ce qu'il y a des réarrangements dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre de ces projets. Mais globalement, il faut dire que notre coopération ne souffre pas de ces évolutions politiques, puisque nos projets sont pour l'essentiel donc au niveau national. Et même pour les projets multinationaux, nous avons des cadres qui permettent de poursuivre la mise en œuvre des programmes. Maintenant, s'il y a nécessité d'apporter des réarrangements, je pense que ça peut toujours se faire. Donc, je pense qu'il y a justement cette flexibilité que nous apportons donc, dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre des projets, surtout les projets peut-être multinationaux. Mais globalement, ce qu'il faut retenir, c'est qu'en termes de coopération, en termes de programmation, nous ne sommes pas, il n'y a pas beaucoup d'impact par rapport à ces mutations, enfin, à ces évolutions au niveau du contexte politique. La banque est dans sa dynamique de renforcer l'intégration régionale. Donc, c'est un des objectifs de la Banque africaine de développement. Et dans ce cadre, nous nous appuyons beaucoup sur les communautés économiques régionales. Mais voilà, donc nous avons aussi comme principal canal également les États et nous continuons à mener la coopération avec tous les États concernés. En ce qui concerne la question sur les agences, la collaboration avec les agences des Nations Unies, bien évidemment, effectivement, nous avons c'est vraiment un partenariat que nous poussons. Nous l'avons eu au Burundi, en tout cas, ce que tu demandes par rapport à l'expérience, donc avec l'OIM dans le cadre d'un soutien d'un projet à la diaspora, avec l'UNHCR pour un appui ciblé aux réfugiés dans le cadre justement de la facilité d'appui à la transition. Donc, nous avions reçu donc des fonds que nous avons utilisés avec les Nations Unies. Présentement, nous sommes en discussion avec le PAM et l'UNICEF dans le cadre du Climate Action Window pour justement, ici au Burkina, un projet d'adaptation dans le secteur d'adaptation au changement climatique dans le secteur de l'agriculture. Et donc, nous sommes en train donc de préparer un projet dans ce sens qui sera effectivement mis en œuvre par ces deux institutions. Donc, c'est vraiment une discussion qui est en cours. Il est vrai que il y a certains États qui parfois aussi veulent avoir la main donc sur la mise en œuvre donc de leur projet, ne pas donner l'impression que ce sont les autres qui viennent exécuter les projets sur le territoire, et ça peut se comprendre, mais nous avons tout le temps ce dialogue, et puis en essayant de comprendre quel est l'avantage comparatif de confier à telle agence pour gagner du temps, pour avoir plus d'efficacité, et je pense que nous parvenons ensemble à trouver des moyens d'avancer donc dans ce partenariat. Donc voilà un peu ce que je pourrais dire à propos donc des questions soulevées par Clément. Merci.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. Actually, Pablo forgot to introduce himself. His name is Pablo Cordova. He's with the UNHCR. So just coming back to the last question, I'll ask Margot to come in last because it was a question on collaboration with UN agencies, knowing WFP is one of the agencies of the UN. So I'd like to hear, either reflection or response from Frederick and Fide. What has been your experience in terms of collaboration with the UN agencies?
Yeah, Fide, you want to start? I think it was first addressed to you, and then I can complement.
Thanks a lot, and I'm happy to start. And thanks a lot, Pablo. I heard the question on how do you factor in flexibility in evaluation, and I think this is really a critical point. And thanks for raising this question. You mentioned the use of scenarios. This is critical for risk assessment at design, and this is really key. This being said, I also heard from Clément that projects in fragile settings actually outperform. And this is something that we also hear from other development partners and development banks we work with. And this is, I think, very interesting. And the approach that we have taken in RCRC in working with development banks and development partners is really to be outcome driven and to use impact as a compass for decision making when it comes to adjusting implementation and course correcting. This is, I think, really key because this is our ability to continue delivering and then making sure that flexibility does not mean exposing ourselves to greater risks, but rather really making sure that we achieve the outcomes and then the intended impact. And then the second point to that, on this paradox of over performing, overachieving in fragile and conflict settings. I think this is really part of where we need further research and further evaluation. How come? Of course, there are a few assumptions and hypotheses. One that I would like to put on the table is one could say that in these projects, there's a lot of attention that is put in understanding the context for one, but also try to work with local actors. And this is part of the experience of the ICRC, is working with local governments as well, when central government is more challenging to work with, and really making sure, for example, that water boards in cities that are under conflict are able to make decisions that they're also able to mobilize and deliver the resources. And I think this is really a learning that potentially can be useful for projects that are not implemented in fragile settings. And in a way, how can we generate global public goods in terms of knowledge by knowing better how to really adapt to the realities of the context we are in. But this is, I think, a very interesting question.
Yeah, maybe just to complement a little bit what Fidi said. I think also, and in our experience now, for instance, with the UNHCR, is also it's really the entry point that that Fidi mentioned to focus on the impact side, that should be a reflection then of the comparative advantages of both institutions. I think this is when you really achieve the synergies, and this is also where then when it offers the opportunities to actually do projects that are co-financed by both institutions, because we also see often that then basically a UN agency can also just be then a service provider. No, I think then it becomes much more complicated there in terms of really having a joint impact in that sense. And I think we have examples now where we also then focus now on the more towards the private sector side. No, they are building there the capacity of refugees, looking at the investment climate so that they can access finance, not financial inclusion. I think this is then basically, these are cases where it becomes clear that there is a comparative advantage that both institutions bring to bear. And I think also if then both institutions also contribute financially, then there is also a different sense of accountability there. And that provides then also the entry point to really scale up the partnership in a much more programmatic way. So this is basically where I think some of the lessons that we see emerging on that front.
Thank you, Frederick. Margot, did you have any response to this?
Thank you, Jane. Maybe just 2 points. I hear you on the working relationship, bank, UN, and I think it's been addressed a little bit on in terms of we know that governments are very quite reluctant in many cases, and rightfully so. But as I think Daniel said, I mean the problems are really huge, and the scale, and who does do what best to actually reach the the impact required at the scale required with the transformation required, I think appreciate all the efforts done by all and everyone, I think, to truly honestly see who's best placed to do what and try to have that dialogue with governments and beyond, no? But also important, extraordinarily important, I think, and I mentioned it in the very beginning, to find these ways of co-financing and to build things together. Because it's scattered, and I think if we need to be much more creative and much more deliberate in finding co-financing, even if it's small, but it does bring you to a combined shared goal and shared vision. So I think that's something we really need to work on, because indeed, one keeps on telling us that the indicators are good and the performance is good. What from our lens we see is the food insecurity and the nutrition insecurity is not good. And over the last years, it's 3-4 times worse than it was before. So there's still quite some work to do on that front. The second point I thought was interesting with Clément. I think he was mentioning that. I think there's been reflections on, doing evaluations in these fragile settings is extraordinarily difficult. No, we have had experience with the World Bank on the DIME evaluations in the resilience side, and it's very difficult also to actually go there, and particularly for the bank, I think, to actually even be allowed to go there, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not easy. And there's been discussions on how are we bringing maybe a coalition of partners truly together to think through the resilience, the framework, the framework on what we're measuring, the framework of what the rules of the games are, and how we can bring those experiences together. So I don't know if it's a totally impossible idea, but to sort of say what is a board of experts of sorts, with local research institutions, with ongoing programs, to try to define what we mean by the resilience programs in, let's take the Sahel, or let's take maybe even only just the 3 Central Sahel countries. I don't know. We can limit it or make it as broad as we can, but just show that we come together on these evaluations, and therefore then we come together, obviously, on better programming as a result of it. So I think the bringing the evaluators and these divisions together with local actors, insisting on that one, could be maybe something interesting to reflect on.
Okay, thank you all. So now we'll switch to questions from our online participants. I'll give the floor to Raki. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. Nous avons des participants en ligne qui ont levé déjà la main et qui viennent de baisser la main. Je vais vous demander s'il vous plaît, est-ce que vous pouvez lever la main? Ah, voilà. Alors, nous avons Maouzou Kindo, s'il vous plaît. Okay. Vous avez la parole. Merci.
Okay. Merci bien. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Alors, je suis Kindo Maouzou, je suis chercheur en économie. Alors, je voudrais tout d'abord remercier les différents panélistes pour la clarté de leur exposé. Alors, j'ai une question adressée à M. Ndoye. Dans son intervention, il a souligné que la banque, dans sa stratégie d'intervention, réalise des évaluations de fragilité qui permettent d'identifier les besoins. Alors, je voudrais savoir, est-ce que dans ce contexte, comment est-ce que la banque intègre dans sa stratégie les questions de relèvement dans son ensemble? Est-ce que ces évaluations-là intègrent les coûts, par exemple, de reconstruction dans ces pays dits fragiles? Merci.
Nous allons prendre également la question de Madame Saouda. L'intervention. Merci.
Allô? Allô?
Ok, j'ai vu le micro. Bonjour à tous et
Allô?
tous. Oui, je suis là, je ne sais pas si...
Allô?
On me reçoit?
Dans 5 minutes. Là, c'est de la part de Madame Saoudata, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, est-ce qu'on me reçoit?
On vous reçoit, merci.
Ok, d'accord, merci beaucoup. Donc, je suis Saoudata Oualet Aboubakine de l'association Tininan, qui est une organisation de femmes pastorales autochtones établie au Sahel depuis, pour la partie burkinabé, ça fait plus de 20 ans. Et dans les autres pays aussi, ça fait longtemps. Et donc, j'ai suivi vraiment, merci de m'avoir permis de suivre ces échanges très, très importants qui touchent nos réalités directement en tant que communauté, je vais dire bénéficiaire, mais aussi en tant qu'actrice de la société civile humanitaire et de développement qui a développé pas mal, qui a eu la chance d'avoir pas mal d'expertise dans la question. En étant comme exemple, je donnerai l'exemple du partenariat que nous avons eu avec la coordination humanitaire au Burkina Faso lors de la crise, surtout de 2012 jusqu'à, on a continué jusqu'aux années 2017 comme ça. Et puis, voilà, et après, c'est sûr qu'on a continué les actions comme on le fait selon nos moyens. Et dernièrement, nous avons contribué aux échanges d'expériences et avec, dans le cadre de l'élaboration du profil genre, mais aussi de l'élaboration de certains projets au Mali, mais aussi bien que celui du Burkina dont un de la BAD avait parlé. Je pense que c'est un projet sur la résilience, les femmes, tout ça. Là, voilà, je n'ai pas retenu le nom exact. Bon, nous, en fait, franchement, les défis qu'il y a qu'on voulait soulever, profitant des acteurs qui sont autour de la table, les banques aussi bien que les CICR, mais je pense aussi à d'autres acteurs, nos institutions, peut-être il y en a qui sont présentes. C'est vraiment la lenteur aussi des actions. Parce que des acteurs comme nous qui sont non seulement au niveau local, très local, mais aussi au niveau international, nous voyons comment les choses se répètent, etc. Et nous voyons vraiment une lenteur. Nous savons que pour la partie Afrique de l'Ouest, et particulièrement, si on le dit, les pays de l'AES, c'est sûr que la question sécuritaire constitue aussi un défi qui fait des difficultés sur plusieurs aspects. Non seulement l'aspect même d'accès au terrain avec les mais aussi il y a un défi qui avait été soulevé par certains acteurs, la facilitation des dialogues et voilà, la convenance des autres, des uns et des autres différents acteurs autour de la table, comme voilà, nos autorités, nos pays, et puis les bailleurs de fonds, les intervenants. Et puis, bon, voilà, tout ça affecte aussi la participation finalement de la société civile et particulièrement les femmes et les jeunes parents pauvres de l'histoire. Donc, voilà, par exemple, le projet en question au Burkina, nous, voilà, on a été appelés à certains moments autour de la table, mais après, ça fait des mois, on ne sait plus qu'est-ce qui se passe. Voilà. Et puis, nous sommes quand même des organisations, des structures qui ont démontré que ça soit aussi sur les aspects de paix, à la coordination humanitaire, par exemple, lors de notre expérience, un des rôles qu'on a joué, c'était aussi la facilitation entre les bénéficiaires qui étaient les réfugiés, qui étaient dans des situations très, très compliquées. Culturellement, ils ne se comprenaient pas avec les intervenants et de l'autre côté, il y a le côté des intervenants. Donc, on a réussi à défier beaucoup de challenges avec notre implication, notre participation. On a été aussi impliqué dans les aspects de cohésion sociale et de la paix. Pour les actions, le côté autonomisation, et je félicite notre intervenante Margot, qui a beaucoup touché cet aspect aussi. Effectivement, au fur et à mesure, en regardant par exemple notre site web, malgré le manque d'accès et de ressources sérieuses que nous avons, on a quand même développé des expériences qui montrent que effectivement, les micro-projets axés sur les femmes et filles aussi, ça donne et ça les sécurise mieux en termes de sécurité alimentaire, d'accès à leurs premiers besoins, mais aussi sur d'autres aspects de participation, s'impliquer à la prise de décision et même d'autres questions concernant les VBG et autres. Donc, pour revenir à la question de paix, effectivement, on ne peut pas aller sans la paix. Il faut vraiment, ce côté-là aussi, il faut y penser. Je sais que vous y pensez, mais bon, voilà, c'est sur la table, c'est très bien. Donc, il y a l'aspect qui a été développé par notre frère de la Banque du Burkina, Daniel, en disant que oui, bon, voilà, il faut bien insérer ça dans les interventions. Oui, nous, on pense que ça doit être transversal et ça doit aussi toucher l'aspect, je sais que ça se fait, mais bon, c'est pas facile, toucher l'aspect sécurisation des communautés isolées, certaines communautés isolées dans des coins et des communautés PDI, etc. Maintenant, les actions en général, comme elles se passent, il va falloir aussi...
Excusez-nous, Madame Saoudata, excusez-moi. Est-ce que vous pourriez juste essayer de clôturer? On a encore d'autres participants, s'il vous plaît. Excusez-nous. Merci.
En disant qu'il faut vraiment revoir aussi les approches. Les approches sont très importantes parce que pour nous, ces types d'acteurs-là, ce que nous voyons, globalement, beaucoup de programmes sont vraiment, moi je vais le dire, c'est comme presque du saupoudrage pour nous. Ça n'atteint pas le vrai, les vraies cibles comme il le faut. Alors que, voilà, avec même peu de moyens des fois, s'il y a une approche vraiment inclusive où on considère vraiment, on met autour de la table de A à Z ces groupes-là, ces communautés, je pense qu'on y gagnerait mieux sur tous les aspects. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Saoudata. Je pense que il n'y avait pas de questions spécifiques, mais plus une contribution, et on vous remercie beaucoup pour cela. Monsieur Marcel, vous avez la parole, merci. Monsieur Marcel? Votre micro est fermé. Monsieur Marcel, vous êtes toujours là? OK. Frédéric, would you like to take some questions from the chat, or would you like me to support on that?
If you, I don't see this very well, so if you could maybe just ask some, and then I'm happy to address them.
Allô?
Oh, there is Marcel. Who?
Allô?
Oui, on vous entend.
Je pense qu'il a peut-être un souci de connexion. C'est mieux de continuer avec.
Monsieur Marcel, est-ce que vous nous entendez? On vous entend. OK. Je vais passer à une question du chat. The question is related to the definition of fragility. How do you define it, and which dimension do you take into account to define it? Conflict, climate change, institutional inequality. Is there a common definition across partners or convergence on how you consider fragility? I think it's a question for all the panelists and also for you, Frédéric. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for this question. It's a very good question, and I would like to invite you to have a look at our strategy for addressing fragility and building resilience. Another 2022 version. It's online. Because this is also where we reflect a little bit on the evolution of our own understanding of what constitutes fragility, and the need to complement this with also then an understanding of resilience. Now, for us, as I mentioned, like we look at it and in terms of pressures that are multidimensional, no, and then how they relate to a country's capacity to respond to them. And now, what we see, however, in the international community is that there are still very different approaches to this topic. And I think particularly also it's not just on the concept of it, but then also on the operationalization. And so this is why then you see some that really focus on still a list of countries where they say this is the list of countries. This is where we now have to basically be fragility sensitive. Or so on, but then it's a list of countries, and whereas for us we have moved beyond that, and we are looking at this at the topic of fragility and resilience, basically also through the lens of a regional and the global public good. I think we have the pandemic has also exposed the fragilities globally that exist within the particular health sector. Then we also see now an increasing recognition around fragilities when it comes to the economic and financial dimensions, no, and then I think the link also of fragility and I think that they're also not equally important to build resilience when it comes to climate change is now increasingly recognized. So. This to say that there is no one common approach to it there, but I think we do have overall an understanding of what it is. I mean, from our point, at least at the African Development Bank, we know how we should be dealing about it, because it's important for us to mainstream this entire consideration into our into the bank's work. So while then, of course, also providing a dedicated support to where this to these environments where fragility is most of a challenge, no? But I think it's very important really to recognize also the pockets of fragility, the subnational dimensions, no? When we look at also then middle income countries where we see how they are affected by it. So yeah, I think this is how we approach it. But yeah, maybe my colleagues can complement that view with their own understanding.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Daniel, Margot, or Philly, would you like to also respond, please?
Okay.
I'm very fine. Sorry, Daniel, go ahead. I was just saying that I adhere to what Frédéric described.
Ok. Non, bon, pour moi, je pense que je n'ai pas quelque chose à ajouter sur la question de la fragilité. Frédéric l'a bien défini. J'aurais peut-être souhaité avoir des réponses répondre sur les autres questions, mais peut-être je vais d'abord laisser à Philly s'il a des compléments sur ce point. Mais sinon, je suis parfaitement en cohérence avec la réponse de Frédéric.
Merci Margot et Daniel. Philippe, vous avez une contribution en plus?
Non, merci. Non, je souscris entièrement aux éléments que Frédéric a partagés. Donc, la dimension multifacette de la fragilité appelle aussi une réponse holistique. Moi, je pense que c'est ce que je retiens principalement.
Merci beaucoup. Je pense que nous arrivons à la fin de cette session. Merci beaucoup. Donc, je vais redonner la parole à Frédéric pour les 3 points clés à retenir de cette session et remercier les panélistes. Merci Frédéric. Je te donne la parole.
Yeah.
Daniel?
Oui, Frédéric, peut-être qu'il y avait une question, je pense, qui avait été soulevée par M. Kindo sur comment, sur la question du relèvement, sur comment nous tenons compte de l'évaluation de la fragilité, dans l'évaluation de la fragilité, de la question du relèvement et de reconstruction. Donc, je pense que sur ce point, peut-être que c'est la réponse qu'il faut apporter. Je pense que, et ça, c'est un peu en lien avec le point, la question de la fragilité, parce que la fragilité aussi, c'est plusieurs étapes. Il y a plusieurs cas de fragilité, des pays qui sont donc à des étapes de conflit, des pays qui sont à des étapes où on est en phase de reconstruction, où on est en phase peut-être de consolidation, ou bien également, même avant même le conflit, lorsqu'on commence à sentir les effets ou bien des risques d'une dégradation de la situation. Donc, l'analyse de la fragilité permet peut-être d'avoir une vue plus claire de à quel stade on se trouve et de quelle action on peut faire pour soutenir vraiment pour soutenir le pays. Donc, ça peut ne pas forcément être des actions de relèvement, mais justement des actions pour prévenir une situation qui va émerger, ou bien des actions pour renforcer les institutions, faciliter la cohésion sociale, etc., avant peut-être d'avoir également le volet reconstruction et réinvestissement. Mais ce que je dois dire, c'est que dans les stratégies de la banque, la fragilité, c'est effectivement un input, mais ce n'est pas peut-être le seul, ce n'est pas le seul instrument que nous utilisons pour élaborer la stratégie d'intervention de la banque. Et aussi, il faut savoir que la banque n'est pas le seul acteur. Et donc, parfois, lorsqu'on parle de besoins de reconstruction, de relèvement, les besoins sont importants. Et donc, la banque a sa part de responsabilité, mais n'est pas le seul acteur. Et il faudra effectivement compter avec tous les partenaires pour pouvoir appuyer ces activités. Peut-être un dernier point par rapport à l'intervention de Mme Ouale Aboubakrine. Donc, c'est vrai, ce sont des commentaires, mais je pense qu'effectivement, c'est important et ça nous permet donc d'insister à nouveau sur l'importance d'impliquer les communautés locales, les organisations de la société civile locale. Tout cela, effectivement, peut se faire à travers donc, des cadres définis. Et là, le rôle de l'État est important, mais je pense que nous aussi, nous avons notre rôle à jouer en faisant ce plaidoyer, en demandant donc une plus grande implication et puis aussi en renforçant davantage les capacités de ces structures qui parfois, pour la prise en compte donc, de certaines activités, peuvent nécessiter des renforcements de capacités. Et je pense que Margot l'a souligné, l'importance donc de renforcer ces organisations au niveau local et de leur permettre donc de jouer un plus grand rôle dans les zones de fragilité. Voilà quelques commentaires que je voulais rajouter. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Daniel. Je laisse également la parole rapidement à mon collègue Clément Bansé, qui aimerait également ajouter une contribution à la vôtre. Merci.
Ok, merci Raki, merci Daniel pour la pertinence de ta réponse. Ce que je voulais ajouter, c'est une des difficultés que nous avons vues sur le terrain à travers nos évaluations. Il faut dire que oui, le point de départ, c'est une analyse complète, approfondie, pour identifier clairement les facteurs de fragilité. Donc, c'est la qualité de cette analyse qui permet d'identifier clairement les facteurs, les sources de la fragilité, et qui est ensuite traduit dans le document des stratégies pays et également sur les opérations à travers le prisme de fragilité. Ce qu'il faut saluer, c'est que, en tout cas, la banque a pu donner un contenu concret. Comme Frédéric l'a montré, qu'est-ce qu'on entend par la fragilité? Quels sont les différents types les facteurs de fragilité? Et comment est-ce qu'on peut traduire cela dans nos stratégies et opérations? Alors, mais Daniel, dans ses interventions, a souligné un point qui est important, c'est que dans certains pays, pour des questions politiques et autres, les gouvernants n'acceptent pas le qualificatif de pays en fragile, de pays fragiles. Alors, donc ça montre un peu la difficulté que la banque a des fois pour pouvoir travailler dans ce contexte. Alors, nous avons vu des situations où la banque a produit des études sur la fragilité et c'est des documents, des fois, qui ne sont pas acceptés par les autorités des pays parce qu'ils refusent qu'on les considère comme pays fragiles, mais qui sont nécessaires pour la banque pour bien comprendre le contexte et intervenir. Alors, donc, face à cette difficulté, je crois que en termes de réaction aujourd'hui, la banque a systématisé l'application de ce prisme-là à tous les pays, membres régionaux, au nombre de 54. Donc, personne ne pourra dire qu'il est fragile ou pas, mais ça permet clairement à la banque de pouvoir identifier les facteurs de fragilité et de voir dans quelle mesure elle peut les traduire dans ses stratégies et ses opérations. Donc, c'est ce que je voulais ajouter pour dire que le défi demeure et que, voilà, il faut travailler de façon continue à considérer cette question de fragilité. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Clément. Frédéric, over to you.
Yes. For closing remarks or to continue the conversation, just to clarify.
I think we will have to close because we are the interpreters. We need
Very
to
good.
think also
Very
about
good.
them, so you can close. But if you have a short remark, please go ahead, but we need to close. Thank you.
Yes, no, excellent. No, I think I just want to use this opportunity to thank again our independent evaluation department, particularly Jane and you, Raki, for having organized this session, and having invited our partners to this, and for encouraging us to have this frank conversation. And I very much welcome also the feedback and the questions from participants. I hope you all found it useful, and please do not hesitate to reach out to our different institutions to explore how we can work together on this agenda. And then lastly, I think just to you, Raki, that maybe that we have a follow-up conversation with our panelists around this discussion that we've just had, and explore a few entry points how we can work together. I think the Western Africa is an environment where we are already collaborating, and we will, so that we explore how we can deepen this collaboration and thereby put in practice what we have just discussed. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and really thank you, Margot, Afidi, and Danielle, for making yourselves available to work with us on this topic and contribute to this discussion. So thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you, Frederick. Now I will give the floor to Jane. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So in closing, because I know I'm in between continuing the discussion or lunch. So I'll be quick. So in closing, I want to thank our panelists and participants for your valuable contributions. I mean, this discussion on fragility, resilience, and innovative partnership actually provided some fresh ideas, insights for the transformational change in fragile African context. So overcoming these challenges demand multi-sector collaboration. But for me personally, the biggest takeaway from this conversation is actually the change of perception. Okay? There are 2 points that were shared by the panelists, and I think it was Fidi who mentioned, for example, in terms of perception, in terms of how we engage with the other players, you know, the private sector are much quicker to respond in these fragile situations. Again, that brings back to the conversation around the comparative advantage of the different players in those kind of situations. The second perception was that I need also to change is around, and I think it's a point that Clément did bring, whereby projects in fragile situations, some of them are still performing. So that is one thing also that we have to recognize. So I hope today's conversation inspired concrete action and strengthened our commitment for sustainable peace and development and resilience. So once again, thank you for your dedication to this important mission. A special thank you to my new friends, I hope, Frederick, Fidi, Margot, and Daniel, and of course you participants. Thank you so much. So our program continues this afternoon at 2 p.m. GMT with 2 sessions. So starting with evaluating for impact, improving quality of life, which will be followed with the closing ceremony at 4 p.m. GMT, which will mark the end of this important evaluation week. Again, for our online participants, as you sign off, please take a few seconds, few minutes to fill our brief survey. Once again, thank you so much, and I hope to see most of you in the afternoon session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you very
Merci,
much,
merci à
Frédéric.
tous.
Thank you, Daniel. Ça va? Merci
Thank you,
beaucoup.
Margot. À
Au
bientôt.
revoir, à
Merci.
bientôt.
Au
À
revoir à
bientôt.
tous.
À bientôt.
Bientôt, à bientôt.
Au revoir.
À bientôt. Au revoir. Au revoir.